Chapter 314. Several decades ago, Li Pifu had been the commander of the 17th Armored Division of the Federation's 1st Military Region. He had participated in the Federation's expedition against the Empire, assassinating the Empire's emperor and turning the tide. After that, he had commanded the Federal Army to fight like a god in the continuous battles that followed. He had made great contributions and became the undisputed number one person in the military, and even the number one person in the Federation. Ever since that black M37 mecha had swept across the battlefield like a mad dragon, amidst the encirclement of 200 Imperial Royal Mecha battalions, and killed the Emperor of the Empire, no one in this universe dared to call him by his name anymore. No matter where he appeared, he would always be greeted with passionate gazes of excitement and admiration. Because of a person like him, the Lees of Philadelphia, a normal citizen family, actually had some semblance of a 1,000-year-old family. Even the 7 great families with 10,000 years of heritage did not dare to slight him. The people of the Empire hatefully called him a beast, the people of the Federation respectfully called him a war god, and successive presidents of the Federation politely called him Grand Marshal. Today, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation, the commander of the 1st Military Region, General Miles, the commander of the 3rd Military Region, and many high-ranking officers in the Ministry of Defense and the Fleet were all subordinates of this war god. For these high-ranking officers, they were not used to calling Li Pifu a war god or a grand marshal, because that would seem too distant and too weird. They had their own unique way of addressing him. For example, General Miles was used to calling him teacher, General Hong Yuliang was used to calling him teacher, and the former head of the Ministry of Defense was used to calling him boss. These old subordinates also had a common name for Li Pifu, and this name was affectionate and respectful, and that was Old Man. However, today, in the military prison of Allure, when this young prisoner saw Li Pifu, he called him Old Man. Old Man and Old Man seemed to only have a difference of one word, but the meaning they represented was as different as heaven and earth. The Major General of the Ministry of National Defense and the Warden, who had accompanied the military god and his grandson into the prison, had a very interesting expression on their faces when they heard these words. They stared at Su Lo, who was at the door, as if they would drag him out and shoot him at any time. However, Li Pifu, who was sitting across the table, did not have any reaction. The old man just quietly looked at the young man at the door. Gradually, a trace of emotion spread from his old face, and finally turned into a kind of understanding, slightly disappointed smile. How many years had it been since he heard this name? War god Li Pifu looked at this young man, but his thoughts drifted back to countless years ago. Ever since he was a child, he had always followed the rules and etiquette. Whether it was when he was in the Junior Military Academy in Philadelphia, or when he went to the other side of the universe with his younger brother to study under that teacher, he had always been so. Every step he took was cautious and he would never make a mistake. Li Pifu had always been cautious, but he was never muddle-headed. The only time he took an uncertain risk was when he assassinated the Emperor of the Empire. This kind of temperament, in the words of his younger brother, was that he was only 18 years old, but his mentality was already 80 years old. On your 18th birthday, you started to call me old man, the old man quietly recalled in his heart. He could not help but sigh. From the 2 words old man, he finally confirmed the relationship between the young man in front of him and that guy. Sit down. The old man gestured for everyone in the room to leave, and then invited Su Lo to sit down. Su Lo sat down with the sound of the shackles, but he still felt that everything that happened today was somewhat unbelievable. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the military god across the table. He felt a bit like a year ago when he woke up in the hospital and saw Jian Shui'er under the sun after waking up. It was just a dream, but he still saw the person who logically could only appear in dreams. When he saw Lady Tai for the first time at the back of Macho's mountain, Su Lo was already incomparably nervous. After all, the 7 great Federation families were a distant and vague concept to him. However, the old man across the table was the object of worship for countless Federation citizens. There were several articles about him in the Federation's electronic basic education materials. These past few years, the Federation's publicity, movies, and documentaries had already deeply rooted this person's image in the hearts of the people, and it was difficult to erase it. Su Lo was no exception. Although he was a bit undisciplined, he still felt respect and fear for this great hero who had saved the Federation. These two complementary emotions came from his bones. How were his years in Donglin? Li Pifu looked at the somewhat nervous Su Lo and suddenly opened his mouth to ask a very abrupt question. At this time, all of the surveillance equipment in the interrogation room had been turned off. No matter how strict the rules of the military prison were, in front of Li Pifu, it was not a problem, and no one dared to pry into this strange conversation. This question was indeed very abrupt. Even if other people heard it, they might not understand it in a short time. But regarding this question, Su Lo had thought about it for a very long time. Ever since he fought with Madman Li and Lin Yuan, he had been thinking about this. Suddenly, he was about to get the answer today. His lips couldn't help but dry slightly. A moment later, he said in a hoarse voice, "It's okay. He just drinks and eats meat every day. He opened an electrical repair shop, and every week he goes to the sanatorium to play. Yes, he likes to eat meat very much. But I never understood whether he liked the feeling of eating meat or the pleasure of destroying the Federation system." The old man sighed softly and said calmly, "You are his student." Su Lo nervously scratched his head with his right hand. Although the old man in front of him was wearing casual clothes and looked old and frail, he felt that there was an abnormally solemn mood in the room that was squeezing the air and his brain. Perhaps it was because of the old man's name and history. Su Lo felt that there was an abnormally solemn mood in the room that was squeezing the air and his brain. I am a repairman in the shop. I don't know if I count as a student." He raised his head and said somewhat helplessly. "He passed on the most precious thing of the Li family to you, and you learned it. Naturally, you are his student." The old man's eyes were calm, but they were soul-stirring. He slowly said, "What do you call him?" "Precious thing of the Lis of Philadelphia." Su Li's heart tightened slightly. He secretly wondered whether this referred to the power in his body or the bangle on his left wrist. Would the war god take back his family's things? Ever since he entered the interrogation room, he had deliberately hidden the bangle on his left hand. At this time, he even subconsciously put it under the table. "I call him Uncle Feng Yu." The old man was silent for a long time. Then he slowly said, "I thought that since you have been with him for so long, you should at least know something. His name is not Feng Yu, nor is it Yu Feng. His surname is Li, and he is my younger brother." Even though he had already prepared himself and speculated, when he heard the war god personally confirm that the uncle who had taught him for many years really had such a close relationship with the Lis of Philadelphia, Su Lo could not help but feel shocked and hesitant. His left hand, which was hidden under the table, began to tremble uncontrollably. This was not because he was preparing to attack, but because there was an indescribable feeling. 10 valiant close-range combat postures, and the strange power in his body that was generated because of these postures. These were the things that Su Lo could not understand when he valiantly charged into the capital ring and broke through the sky. But at this moment, he suddenly found the answer. At this moment, he thought of the disdain of the uncle when he mentioned the war god that everyone revered. He also thought of many things. He also thought of when he fought with Lin Dohai's elite bodyguards under the Gangdu Hotel. When the powerful person called Kong Wu was injured and fell to the ground, he was extremely terrified. "Your surname is Li. Your surname is not Su. You are a member of the Li family." Su Lo sat at the table and put his trembling left hand on his leg. He lowered his head and thought back to Kong Wu's terrified expression that day. How operatic that was. However, the uncle's past had affected his present. How much did it sound like Schiller's absurd early-stage opera? How was he during those years in Donglin? Was he happy? Just as Su Lo was in a state of shock, the old man's indifferent and nostalgic words once again rang out in the quiet room, pulling him out of that indescribable emotion. He raised his head and looked seriously at the war god's aged face for the first time. He wanted to connect this most famous face in the Federation with Uncle Feng Yu's face. Not bad. Just a toothache. His teeth are basically all broken, Su Lo replied softly. After Li Pifu heard this, his aged face dimmed slightly. He paused for a moment to reminisce, then he recovered his calm. He asked lightly, "Can I trouble you to tell me the specifics of his life in Donglin? I'm more interested in this." In Feng Yu's words, Su Lo was born with the ability to see through people's hearts. That was because his nature was too simple, direct, and clean, so the appearance of others was not an obstacle for him. Even though the person sitting across the table today was the most respectable person in the Federation, after calming down for a moment, Su Lo understood what the old man needed the most. After a moment of silence, he began to quietly describe the uncle's life in Zhonglo Street and the mine. For example, the uncle's laziness, the uncle's gluttony, what brand of red wine the uncle liked to drink, how well his beef was fried, how much he liked to watch 23rd Uncle Dao's TV series, and that little girl with a head full of purple hair the most. The interrogation room was completely silent. Only Su Li's slightly hoarse voice could be heard as he described the ordinary life of a Level 1 fugitive from the Federation. The old man and Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng behind him listened silently the entire time. Only at the end did the old man say with emotion, "The stars are easy to fall into disorder, but one's nature is hard to change. After all these years, the things he likes are still the same. I just didn't expect that with his temperament, he could actually endure so many years of loneliness." When he heard that Feng Yu liked that little girl with purple hair the most, the old man didn't express any opinion. However, Li Feng behind him frowned slightly. No matter how plain and complicated the story was, there was always an end. The room was silent for a long time. Li Pifu looked at Su Lo and suddenly asked directly and simply, "Is the star map in your hands?" This question came very suddenly. After the warm and emotional narration of the long memories, it was like a brush stroke from the heavens, giving rise to a biting cold feeling. Chapter 3:15. After all, the war god was not a real god. As an old man, his hatred for that brother of his who had cut ties with him decades ago gradually faded and was replaced by nostalgia, which led to this conversation and reminiscence. While recounting Uncle Feng Yu's life in Donglin, Su Lo could not help but be immersed in the memories of his youth. Sad or happy, most of them were plain learning, training, and reading, but they were the times he cherished the most. After escaping from Donglin, as a fugitive, Su Lo did not have many opportunities to talk about his past with others. Today, in front of this old man, this was the first time he could slowly narrate without any psychological barriers, so it was inevitable that he was immersed. Just as he was immersed in a warm state, he was shocked by the sudden question. He subconsciously raised his head and met the old man's eyes. In this moment, the old man's eyes no longer held any emotion or nostalgia, much less any warmth or kindness. They were as calm as a mirror, as cold as ice, and as sharp as a knife. They cut through the space of the interrogation room and pierced deeply into Su Li's eyes. In the past, Su Lo had only heard of gazes as sharp as knives in literature. Only today did he know that this description was actually true. In this world, there really were people whose gazes could be so sharp that they seemed tangible. Because this person was called Li Pifu. This person had once stood above tens of thousands of people, watching the black clouds bloom on the planet, watching the wreckage of battleships scatter among the stars, watching the severed limbs and bloody corpses on the battlefield, and seeing the flower-like Mecca. He had once, at the closest distance, seen the stunned and gloomy eyes of an emperor of an empire before he died. This kind of person, this kind of gaze, the condensation of countless years of life and death, the wisdom of strategy, and the piercing killing intent that soared to the heavens, how could a normal person bear it? Sulu only felt that he was suddenly in the coldest winter day in Linhai province, his entire body naked. Then, he was splashed with a basin of cold water from head to toe. Finally, a cold knife pierced between his eyebrows, freezing his brain and hurting his spine until his nerves were numb. He could not summon any thoughts of resistance or the courage to lie. What star chart? In the ice cellar, he subconsciously answered in a daze. Then, relying on his strong nerves and instinct to not lower his head under the pressure, he slowly returned to normal and felt a trace of warmth begin to accumulate in his heart. Fei Qingli Pifu, who was this kind of person? At first, he warmly reminisced about the past, but in the silence, a clap of thunder sounded in the biting cold. During the conversation, he meticulously and perfectly displayed the commanding wisdom that he had once used on the battlefield, in order to get the truest answer from Su Lu. The old man quietly looked at Su Li's eyes. He noticed that there was fear in the young man's slightly narrowed eyes, but it quickly turned into calmness. There was confusion, but it soon turned into doubt. However, there was no trace of strangeness or concealment. He knew that the young man was indeed like what he said subconsciously. He did not know what the star atlas was. Hearing this answer, the old man's expression was slightly gloomy. He seemed to be a bit disappointed, but a gratified look flashed in his eyes. It was really puzzling that all kinds of contradictions would appear in the body of the Federation's god of war, who was as unmoving as a mountain. What exactly was the so-called star atlas? The sudden questioning that seemed to come from the sky did not end. Before Su Lu completely got rid of this confusion, the old man slightly raised his eyes. The sharp light in his eyes suddenly appeared and then disappeared. He stuck out the tip of his tongue and forced out an old and hoarse voice from his dry lips. It was like two claps of thunder. Do you know how to change the chip? The god of war, Li Pifu, was already old. When his thin and old body sat on the chair, he looked like a very ordinary old man. However, at this moment, when he suddenly asked the question, a shocking aura surged out of his body, making people feel that his body was suddenly tall and mighty. The most terrifying thing was that the hoarse voice that came out of his dry lips suddenly became so loud and clear. It repeatedly collided in the quiet interrogation room, rumbling like thunder in spring, as if it would never stop. Do you know how to change the chip? This question sounded simple and straightforward. It was like asking Su Lu if he knew how to repair electrical appliances. Do you know how to cook? It was even a bit funny. However, when it came out of the old man's mouth, it was not funny at all. Su Lu felt that his eardrums were a bit painful from the vibrations. His mind was also a bit muddled. He subconsciously thought of the first time he met Mad Manly in Linyuan. This guy also spoke with a buzzing voice, as if there were hundreds of little people in his chest uniformly beating drums. The fact that he had the extra energy to think about these questions proved that Su Lu was not shocked by the god of war's sudden question. At the very beginning, if the imposing old man across the table had asked this question, in his days, even if Su Lu dared to hide the truth, the emotions in his eyes and some small movements of his body would have been seen through by the other. However, Li Pifu had asked about the star map. Su Lu really did not know what a star map was, so he did not lie and safely passed the first question. He had stronger nerves and a stronger will than the average person, so he woke up faster. After the first question, a strong sense of wariness rose in his heart. His eyes were still dazed, but his left hand under the table was already clenched tightly, forcibly controlling every pair of muscle fibers in his body so that the corners of his eyes, brows, and lips would not tremble in the slightest. That depends on what kind of verification chip it is. If it's related to mecha and self-propelled armored vehicles, I'm more proficient, but I'm not very familiar with warship systems. Su Lu rubbed his forehead and began to answer the old man's questions. At first, he was still a little dazed from the shock, but gradually, he became much more natural. In the end, he frowned and looked across the table, asking curiously, "What exactly do you want to ask?" When Li Pifu's aged voice exploded like spring thunder, Li Feng, who had been standing behind him with his hands clasped behind his back, frowned. He lowered his head and lowered his eyes, forcing himself to maintain his composure. He knew the secret of his grandfather's ability to look down on the universe, because this was originally the secret of the Lees of Philadelphia. However, this was also the first time he had learned that his grandfather could actually use that power in his body so miraculously. He could release it without using his own body. A trace of daze flashed through Li Feng's lowered eyes. His father had not embarked on the path of cultivation, so he was probably the person closest to his grandfather. However, when would he be able to reach this level? Was there anyone else in the universe who could be so powerful? That granduncle whom he had never met, but whom his father revered so much, could he do this? Everyone had their own days. Su Lu did not know what Madman Li was thinking right now. Otherwise, he would definitely have told him that back in the day, Uncle Feng Yu had once taken off his armor with his bare hands in the forest on the outskirts of Heshi province. That kind of level, just like the old man in the room today, was not something a normal human could do. Su Lu was only thinking that there should not be any problems with his reaction. The real reason why his uncle was listed as a level 1 fugitive by the Preamble Bureau, the big secret that could break the glory of the charter, should, perhaps, be able to continue being kept by him by luck. However, Li Pifu only looked at him and said lightly, "You're lying." There was a suffocating silence in the interrogation room. Li Pifu looked calmly at Su Lu and said, "To be able to change into a completely new identity, other than your teacher, only you can do this. I only want to know if he helped you or if you completed all of this yourself. If it is the former, you have no meaning to the federal military. If it is the latter, I think the military needs a talent like you." This was a very low-level threat and enticement, but when it came from the mouth of the Federation's military god, it immediately became different. This was because only this old man had enough qualifications to say these words and make his own promise. Su Lu was silent for a long time before he said with difficulty, "Uncle helped me change my identity. I don't understand how he did it. He was a sincere person and rarely lied in life. He was an orphan in Donglin. In order to survive in his childhood, he often had to lie. His twisted and seamless life, the dance of lotus flowers and mud, gave him the most sincere and amiable appearance and even temperament. However, at the core of his appearance and temperament, in his bones, he still retained the craftiness and methods of the lowest level of Federation society. In order to survive, under the cover of the simple and honest sunlight, it was not difficult to tell a big lie and deceive all living things. The military god Li Pifu was not one of the living things. Unfortunately, for the past several decades, he, that madam, and the Bureau of Proclamation only knew that the traitor who wandered the Federation with a different appearance had this ability. However, they did not know the method he used to realize this ability. Thus, at this moment, it seemed that the old man believed Su Li's explanation. The interrogation room once again returned to a deathly silence. After a long time, Li Feng, who stood behind the old man, finally let out a light breath. He took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead. In a few words, Su Lu had already walked the line between life and death. His life had also completely entered a different path. Madman Li definitely did not care about Su Li's life or death. However, he also did not want this person, who was worthy of being his opponent, to silently die in a military prison like this. What made Li Feng even more nervous was the content of his grandfather's questions and the shocking secrets hidden within. He only knew that he had an extremely talented granduncle, but he did not know that his granduncle was a strange person who could break the glory of the charter. So there really was such a fierce person in this universe. At this thought, Li Feng couldn't help but look at Su Lo with a strange expression. He thought to himself that this guy's luck was a bit too good. He was actually able to be accepted as a student by his granduncle. Su Li's expression was as calm as ever, even a bit naive. However, the cold sweat had already soaked the back of his prison uniform, making it sticky and somewhat uncomfortable. After asking these two questions, war god Li Pifu closed his eyes and began to rest. It was as if the spring thunder in the room earlier had not come from his mouth. His entire person once again became that ordinary thin old man from before. There was not a trace of strangeness about him. Qing Cheng's military prison delivered 3 cups of tea. After half of the tea in the cups were gone, the old man's aged voice rang out in the interrogation room that had been silent for a long time. Only when Li Feng came to find me did I know that you were his descendant. The old man put down the teacup and looked at Su Lo as he spoke slowly. Su Lo looked at Li Feng with some surprise. He did not expect that at this time, he would be the one to ask for the war god's help. However, the reason I came to see you this time is not because you are his descendant that I see you in a different light. Although I have done some things for the Federation, my respect for the Federation's charter has always been the same as the day I first stepped into the military camp. It has never weakened in the slightest. Back then, he betrayed the Federation and violated the charter. Even if he was my biological brother, I would not let him go, let alone you. Although he knew that Li Pifu would definitely continue his words, Su Lo could not help but narrow his eyes when he heard this evaluation of his uncle. He retorted, I have been in the capital ring for more than 2 years, and I have seen far too much of the darkness of politics. Uncle betrayed the country. In my opinion, this is just a joke. Sometimes, jokes are not funny. As his student, of course you would stand in his position and explain the past. The old man did not start reminiscing about the past because of this rebuttal. He calmly said, he was a cold and heartless person, but you are different. If you were also a cold and heartless person, of course I would not have come to see you today. In the past 2 days, I have read all the files about you, including the surveillance video. I really want to know a question. When the smoke covered the 3 eastern sectors, how did you aim? Su Lo was silent for a moment before he raised his head and replied, can I not say? Of course you can. Everyone has their own little secrets. I am the same, and so is your uncle. Li Pifu looked at Su Lo with a smile and said, even if you had that little secret, when you killed your way into the Foundation building, other than that excellent sniper, you did not have any backup. How confident were you in killing Macklin at that time? I think, since the children of the Tai family have already come to see you, you should already know Macklin's true identity, the old man calmly added. Su Lo was silent for a moment before he said seriously, in the beginning, I had a partner on the mountaintop. At that time, I was 40% confident that I could kill Macklin. Then he ran away. Although I had Mr. Sher's help, in reality, the situation was very bad. I was not even 10% confident. The old man looked at him and said slowly, if you were not even 10% confident, why didn't you leave at that time? Why did you insist on killing Macklin? What if I didn't kill him? Things had already reached that point. Su Lo lowered his head and answered honestly. Things had already reached that point. Hearing this, the old man's face was no longer stern. In his slightly cloudy and peaceful eyes, there was a hint of pride and a smile. Dozens of years ago, on the territory of the Empire, the 17th Armored Division was in charge of blocking. Seeing the Empire's imperial family's elites covering the sky and covering the earth, how could he have the courage to cross thousands of mountains and rivers to kill that person under the imperial family's flag? Although Division Commander Lee at that time had a terrifying hidden strength that was beyond the imagination of the world, he was taking the biggest risk of his life. How could he have any confidence? Was he willing to do it? He was just at the end of the line, and a sense of injustice and unwillingness suddenly appeared in his chest. He was forced to that point, so he threw away life and death for the sake of speed. The old man quietly looked at the young man across the table with his head slightly lowered. He thought of the surveillance video and felt that the young man in the video was not as silent as he was today. Instead, he felt that the young man in the video was somewhat similar to himself in the past. Thinking about it carefully, this young man could be considered someone from the Lees of Philadelphia. When he thought of this, the hint of admiration in his heart finally appeared on his face without hesitation. It was like a mountain looking at a blue lake in front of a cliff that seemed to have the momentum of an ocean. A sense of joy rose in his heart. The faint admiration on the old man's face did not last long. It turned into calmness. He looked at Sulu and said, "That teacher of yours once made a very dangerous mistake. Naturally, you would not believe it. But since you believe that he will not betray the Federation, then this is the only request I have for your future. Do not betray the Federation. Can you do that?" The old man quietly looked at Sulu. A star lit up in his old and turbid eyes. The divine light was condensed and dignified. After Sulu entered the interrogation room today, his mind had been somewhat perplexed because he saw this important figure. At this moment, when he heard this question, he vaguely grasped something. An unexpected joy surged into his heart. He stared back at Lipifu's old face in a daze. After a long while, he finally replied with a hoarse voice, "Of course." This answer of course was given as a matter of course. Sulu had never believed that the old man was really a traitor who colluded with the Empire. He himself had never thought of betraying the Federation. There was another, of course. In his heart, the Federation and the government were two completely different things. Hearing this answer, the old man was silent for a moment. The wrinkles on his lips became deeper and deeper. He faintly said, "If something goes wrong in the future, I will kill you myself." It was a very ordinary sentence, but it carried a power and certainty that made one unable to resist. If he said he would kill, he would kill. This was the confidence and indifference that had been cultivated through countless years of blood and fire. When Sulu heard this, he only felt numb and cold under his hair. The muscles on his back completely stiffened. Who would not be frightened when the Federation's military god said so seriously that he would kill a person? After the fear came disappointment. Sulu knew that he would survive in the end. His mood suddenly relaxed, and his body also relaxed a lot. Thinking of this, he could not help but look up at Madman Lee, who had been silent all this time. He seriously nodded and said, "Thank you." If Li Feng had not told the details of the fight in the Linyuan to the old man, how could this important figure who had watched the mountains and the fish by the lake for many years personally come to the military prison of Qingqing to see Sulu, the terrorist? "No need to thank me. Yuzi came to find me. If you want to thank someone, thank her. Besides, since you are my student, of course I will not let you die for no reason." Li Feng stood behind the old man. There was a trace of coldness in his expression that did not match his age. There was no sense of his usual craziness. There was only calmness. He said in a cold voice, "I am not doing this for Lu Hua's sake. In my opinion, it is better that he does not have a father like you. I let you live because I hope that we can meet on the battlefield in the future and return that name to you." That name was naturally referring to the bet on the battle on Mount Kaki. From that day on, the genius Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng had to call Sulu uncle whenever he saw him. This was really a great humiliation. The old man suddenly opened his mouth and called, "Li Feng. Here." Madman Li, who was staring coldly at Su Lo, suddenly heard his grandfather's voice. He subconsciously stood at attention and puffed out his chest. The old man looked at Su Lo. Without turning his head, he said lightly, "If Su Lo betrays the Federation in the future and I die of old age, you will be responsible for killing him." Li Feng's eyes flashed with coldness. He said in a low voice, "Yes, Marshal." Su Li's heart skipped a beat. "But if he does not betray, remember to call Su Lo uncle when you see him in the future." Ah! Li Feng's eyes widened. He stared at the back of his grandfather's white head, not knowing what to say. The old man did not pay attention to his reaction. He slowly stood up. Without saying anything to Su Lo, he put his hands behind his back and walked out of the interrogation room with his body slightly bent. Watching the old man's figure walk past him, Su Lo felt as if there was a strong wind blowing past. The wind's speed was extremely slow, but it contained endless power. He knew that he should stand up at this time, but the complicated feelings of shock and relief in his heart made his legs somewhat weak. He had told a big lie about the chip replacement. In the end, he was actually able to fool the Federation's war god. Su Li's face was slightly pale. He sat in the chair, feeling both fear and relief. At this time, the old man suddenly turned his head and glanced at Su Lo. His gaze was like thunder and lightning. It fell on the incomparably hard table, as if it could directly penetrate and look below. Su Li's left hand had been carefully hidden under the table. At this time, he suddenly felt a burning sensation on his wrist. Although he knew that it was caused by his state of mind, he could not help but feel great fear. He had always felt that this war god already knew everything in his heart. Fortunately, the old man did not do anything else. He only smiled and said, "I was not tricking you before. If you really know how to do those things, the Federal Army really needs you. If you can change the chip, you can naturally remove the chip. If you can remove the chip, you can go to the Empire and pretend to be a member of the royal family." These words could not be said to have woken him up. Although Su Lo also hated the Empire's invaders, after all, the war had not started for 10 years. He had not even seen a living person from the Empire, nor did he think about what he could do for this magnificent war. But when he heard these words, his mind still buzzed. He saw a ray of light in the distance. Why did the Empire have the seed plan? Because under the protection of the glory of the Charter, anyone without a chip would not be able to enter the Federation. Why was the Federation never able to obtain first-hand information about the Empire? Because all Federation citizens had a chip on the back of their neck. It was planted in them when they were infants and could not be removed for life. For the Empire, this was the biggest characteristic of the Federation people. Only Uncle Feng knew, only he seemed to be able to freely travel between the Federation and the Empire. If he entered the Empire, wouldn't he be able to do a lot of things for the Federation? This thought flashed through Su Li's mind, and he fell into silence. The sound of footsteps faded away. Su Li stood up with some difficulty and turned his head to send off the backs of the old man and the young man. Above the deep corridor outside the interrogation room was a transparent dome. Sunlight shone in and fell on the old man and the young man. Li Feng was 17 years old this year. His back and waist could not be described with words. His tall and sturdy body contained incomparably terrifying strength. As he walked, every muscle under his military uniform tightened and stretched rhythmically like rocks. It was as if he was a great mountain that breathed in the morning wind. The old man beside Li Feng looked like an ordinary old man. Because of his age, the torment of the countdown to his life made his body slightly weak. Compared to Li Feng, he seemed a bit short. However, it was precisely this old man who slowly walked in the quiet corridor. The light falling from the dome seemed to be only willing to shine on his body. The soldiers on both sides of the corridor saluted with their guns. Their gazes were like the light from the dome, following this old man's movements. The soldiers in the military prison probably never thought that they would actually be able to see the face of the Federation's military god with their own eyes. They were so excited that they found it difficult to control themselves. Their faces were slightly red, and the hands that saluted with their guns trembled slightly. The old man was a true mountain, a mountain that bathed under the sunlight. Sulu stood somewhat woodenly in the interrogation room. He watched as that mountain-like figure disappeared into the distance. He felt as if he was in a dream. He had thought that he would definitely die for killing Macklin, but Macklin was a spy for the Empire. Lady Tai knew his greatest secret, and the Bureau of Proclamation would definitely not let him go. Yet, this old man had appeared to see him. Because of the old man's appearance, he knew that he would definitely survive. Moreover, he would rely on the most extraordinary and magnificent mountain in the Federation. From today onwards, it was likely that no one would be able to use private actions against him. Perhaps even Lady Tai could only forcefully suppress her enmity toward him. The situation changed too quickly. Who could understand what it felt like? From this day onwards, Su Li's life in the military prison of Qingqing became completely different from before. Although he was still imprisoned by strict security measures, the attitude of the prison soldiers toward him became more amiable. He was allowed to watch television and read newspapers. What he wanted to eat every day, there was also a special chef who would prepare it for him. Although he still had to wear the electromagnetic shackles when he moved out every day, the remote-controlled electronic bomb sealed in the firmware had already been carefully taken out. Even the warden of the prison had to go outside his cell every day to have a heartwarming conversation with him. The interrogation of the Federation Investigation Bureau came to an abrupt end. However, the military court sent over the relevant legal documents. Su Luk handed over all the legal issues that needed to be dealt with to Su Songzi. He didn't care about it because he knew that it was all just a formality. The sudden change in prison life was naturally due to the 2 consecutive visits, especially that day when Li Pifu came and talked in the secret room. The military god had made his stance known. The entire Federation had to wash their ears and listen to where the wind was blowing. On a sultry day in June, Su Lo lay on the bed, enjoying the cool and fresh air through the vent. He was eating a bunch of grapes with his left hand and casually flipping through a paper book with his right hand. He was thinking about how he should deal with Shi Qinghai. At this moment, he heard the warden's extremely gentle voice from the intercom. Chapter 316. This was Su Li's last night in Qingqing's military prison. He stood by the window and looked at the wild grass outside. He thought about the ups and downs of this period of time and couldn't help but feel emotional. With a different state of mind, the scenery in his eyes would naturally be somewhat different. His biggest worry after escaping from Donglin had been resolved just like that. Was he going to regain his freedom soon? The Lees of Philadelphia was a towering mountain. Sula knew that the reason he could stand on this mountainside and look down at the scenery peacefully was all because of that uncle whose life he didn't know if he was alive or dead. Even if he was a real rock, after experiencing so many things, if he still couldn't make a reasonable analysis of his life as a fugitive these past few years, then it could only be said that he was a stupid rock. However, Sulu was not stupid. The identity chip behind his neck had been changed, and he was arranged to enter UA University. The chip's authority allowed him to enter H1, and from there, he got to know the Tai family's young master. From there, the young fugitive bumped into the highest circle of the Federation. If it wasn't for Sulu always having a strong desire to kick the uneven parts of the road, if it wasn't for the dark corners of the alleyways that made him feel a little depressed and wanted to light a fire, and if it wasn't for the path that Feng Yu had planned for him, he probably would have already become one of the Federation's youngest lieutenant colonels, a first-class technical supervisor of the Nutshell Company, had a close relationship with the Tai family, and hooked up with the Lees of Philadelphia. It could really be said that his future was bright. However, how could Feng Yu not know Su Li's character? Perhaps the later developments of this story were all within his predictions. Su Li silently thought about this point and couldn't help but feel slightly perplexed. What kind of place was the Lees of Philadelphia? How could these two brothers who lived in the light and darkness be so powerful to such an extent? Their intelligence, their bearing, their extremely terrifying strength, where did they learn it from? Other than Madman Li and himself, he didn't seem to have found anyone else in the Federation who would shiver all over in the summer and transform into some kind of monster. His thoughts were in a mess, and he fell into a light sleep. The night ended without a word. Facing the dawn of dawn, Su Li walked out of the cell under the escort of the officers of the Qingqing military prison and the warden himself. He walked through a long and gloomy passage. Looking at the felons eating breakfast in the cafeteria through the transparent material, Su Li habitually nodded to them. He knew that this prison only held the most heinous criminals. It was not like what was described in literature, where there was endless injustice and darkness. But after all, they had been separated by the bars for more than 20 days. Thinking of his not-so-innocent but somewhat cold experience, he wanted to say hello one last time. The heavy metal gate slowly slid past. After going through 4 strict scanning procedures, Su Li walked out of the Qingqing military prison. He raised his head, squinted his eyes, and looked at the gloomy sky. Then, he turned back to thank the warden and the others. Then, accompanied by 2 officers, he got into the military vehicle. With his hands behind his back, the warden of the military prison watched the military vehicle turn into a small black dot on the gray road. He could not help but sigh softly. As the warden, he was very clear about the traditions and stories of the Qingqing military prison. It was basically impossible for anyone who entered this prison to get out. But as long as a prisoner got out of this prison, he would definitely become a big shot in the Federation in the future. The small-eyed man who left today was probably no exception. After a 3-hour-long flight, the military plane landed at the military airport in the suburbs of the capital. After getting off the plane, Su Li got into another dark green semi-armored military vehicle. The officers in charge of escorting him along the way were not in the mood to chat. Su Li's shackles had been removed, but he did not have the urge to escape. He just squinted his eyes and greedily looked at the familiar streets of the capital outside the window, as well as the row of towering buildings in the distance. The military vehicle stopped without any warning beside the flat pool of grass in front of the Parliament Hill. "Please wait a moment. Someone will come to pick you up immediately." After saying this, the soldier on the military vehicle saluted Su Li and then drove away from the street. Su Li subconsciously returned the salute and then found himself in the core area of the Federation's capital. On the opposite side of the wide street was the majestic Parliament building and those familiar stone steps. The June sun was shining brightly in the sky. On the dark green grass beside them, there were people sitting in groups of 2s and 3s. Everything seemed so peaceful. He was wearing a military uniform without epaulets today and did not have any luggage. At this moment, he was suddenly all alone and standing in the middle of a crowd. He actually felt a little lost and helpless. From time to time, people would walk past him. Many people would take photos not far from him with the Parliament building as the background. No one noticed him, and no one would have thought that this young soldier who seemed to be waiting for someone was the terrorist who had caused trouble for the Federation for half a year. Half a year. Half a year ago, when Su Li was determined to kill Macklin, it was still snowing in the capital. Since then, he had not been free. When he was transferred from Fox Fortress to Qingqing military prison, he, who had been in the dark for a long time, was once blinded by the sunlight that he had not seen for a long time. However, this was not the case today. It was just this change of time and space, this sudden arrival of freedom, that made him feel a little lost. When he left, it was snowing. When he returned, it was already late spring. It was sunny after the snow, and it was really sunny. More than 100 days had passed, but it was actually just a moment. In the blink of an eye, the sky was clear. A black official car slid in front of him, and a few special task force agents wearing black open lapels walked out of the car. One of them looked coldly at Sulu and said, "We have arranged a place for you to bathe and eat. There is not much time. Mr. President still has a schedule in the afternoon. At noon, he will be waiting for you at the official residence." Sulu nodded subconsciously. South of the capital, George Carlin Foundation Cultural and Arts Center. In the largest auditorium of the George Carlin Foundation, the Nebula award ceremony was being held. The award ceremony was supposed to be held in January, but because of the unfortunate death of the Peace Prize candidate, Senator Medellin, it had to be postponed to today. It had to be said that the demonstrations that had occupied Charter Square and the square in front of Parliament Hill for 4 months were one of the important reasons why the award ceremony had to be postponed. The Nebula Award was an official award of the Federation, and its authority and sense of honor were unquestionable. During the process of awarding the Basic Physics Award, Space Technology Award, and Biotechnology Award, the applause in the hall did not stop. All the guests who participated in the award ceremony did not hesitate to express their sincere congratulations to the scholars who won the award. When Governor Ross replaced Senator Medellin to receive the Peace Prize, the applause in the George Carlin Foundation reached its peak. Everyone collectively stood up and expressed their most sincere respect and condolences to the old man who had fought for the Federation all his life, who had bravely resisted the invasion of the Empire, who had adhered to the principle of nonviolence for the rest of his life, and who had finally died at the hands of fanatical nationalistic terrorists in Green Dragon Mountain. This mood continued until the chairman of the Nebula Award Committee raised his voice and invited President Pobre to come on stage to give a speech. Then, there was a slight change. The guests who had just sat down all stood up again to welcome the arrival of the President of the Federation. Over the years, in the upper class of the Federation, the guests who were qualified to appear in the George Carlin Foundation were always somewhat disdainful or indifferent to this dark-skinned politician who came from the lowest class of miners in society. However, Mr. Pobre was now the president of the Federation, so they had to cover up their feelings very well. Especially in the past 6 months, President Pobre led the government cabinet and dealt with the chaos caused by Senator Medellin's death with extreme force and means, ensuring the smooth operation of the Federation. He demonstrated his extremely powerful political wisdom and means. The people in the upper class of the Federation had begun to accept and respect this dark-skinned middle-aged man from the bottom of their hearts. The guests looked at President Pobre on the podium and couldn't help but think about the commotion caused by the Federation government in the past few months in response to Senator Medellin's death. They couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines. The Federation government announced the results of the investigation in the shortest time possible and appeased some people. Meanwhile, President Pobre personally went to Linhai State University City to talk to the excited students. It was said that at the scene of the conversation, President Pobre's tone was calm and his attitude was firm. However, everyone knew that President Pobre had never stopped praising George Carlin. Even the awards ceremony of the Nebula Award was held at the George Carlin Foundation Cultural and Arts Center under his arrangement, 2 hands at the same time, one to appease, the other to be firm. When the fanatical Senator Medellin's youth army in the Federation occupied the square and attacked the Parliament building, and when S2 entered the factory to call for a general strike, President Pobre responded in a way that no one would have thought possible. The 3 major unions, which had been silent for nearly 2 years, came forward. The members of the 3 major unions in the Federation were countless. They represented the ordinary workers and had fought for countless years against the capitalists. They cooperated with the anti-government army in Green Dragon Mountain from afar, and their influence among the lower-class people and industrial workers was extremely far-reaching. No one would have thought that the three major unions would unite and stand on the government's side this time. It was only now that many people realized that President Pobre was born in a family of miners. In the past few years, he had been the chief lawyer of the three major unions until he officially stepped into the political arena. During those years, Mr. Pobre and his subordinates, who were still lawyers, had fought countless public interest lawsuits for the three major unions. They had fought for countless benefits for the lower-class people who had been harmed and insulted. Now, the three major unions had begun to help Mr. Pobre. With the support of the three major unions and the support of the families led by Lady Tai, S2 did not have a general strike like last year. The situation in S1 also quickly calmed down. There were some very subtle changes in the people's inclination. Today, although there were still many people in the Charter Square who were protesting, they could no longer affect the foundation of the Federation. Chapter 317. President Pobre was very different from his predecessors. For this politician who was born at the bottom, the inherent traditions of the Federation were definitely not an untouchable iron curtain. Of course, as the current leader of the Federation, he was not so stupid as to completely ignore compromise and balance and want to blow a strong wind in the universe. The changes he made were slow and careful. For example, the routine ball at the president's official residence for the Nebula Award winners was cancelled. Instead, the president personally attended the award ceremony and gave a passionate speech. Reverence was because of the power and authority that the president represented. Reverence was because of the Federation's political traditions and the embodiment of the Federation's will. The guests looked at President Pobre on the stage, but it did not stop them from becoming more and more confused. Why did the president make such a sudden and temporary change to the Nebula Award ceremony? The content of President Pobre's speech showed the real reason. The first half of the speech was like a very common speech, praising the scientists and artists who had made outstanding contributions to the progress of the Federation. However, the second half of the speech began to become more serious. The guests listened to the speech in disbelief. They could understand the president's criticism of the empire and his concern for the situation in the West Woods, but they could not understand why the president chose today to attack the dead and well-respected Senator Macklin. Even if they were election opponents, even if they had different political views, Senator Macklin was dead, and he was remembered and respected by many people of the Federation. Why did President Pobre do this? Where did his most basic political IQ go? The second half of the speech did not mention Macklin's name, but everyone could understand who the president was targeting. Below the stage, the governor of Jingzhou, Mr. Ross, who was holding the Peace Prize, had an extremely heavy and angry expression on his face. However, President Pobre did not stop talking. He directly pointed out the investigation done by the Capital Daily last year. The dead were gone. Did President Pobre not know that this was a big taboo? The death of a person is not as good as the extinguishing of a lamp. The lamp has light, but the place it cannot illuminate is darkness. If you do something wrong, you have to pay the price. President Pobre looked at the guests who were looking at each other in bewilderment and said coldly, "Perhaps I am not a mature politician, but I am a devoted follower of the Federation's laws. If I die, you can dig up my grave and see what color it is inside. I have the same attitude towards certain dead people." The Nebula Award ceremony ended in this strange atmosphere. President Pable's speech wouldn't be published in the newspapers, but it would definitely be circulated. As for whether it would cause another upheaval in the Federation, which had just been quiet, this was something that no one could predict. When the guests walked out of the George Carlin Center, the first thing they did was to collect the daily newspapers of the Capital Special District for the past week. The the Federation seemed to want to do something about the dead Medellin. President Pobre mentioned the investigation of the Capital Special District daily. Only then did people remember that President Bob and reporter Wood, who had just been discharged from the hospital, seemed to have returned to the newspaper that was famous for exposing the truth. The police car cleared the road, and the black presidential motorcade slowly drove into the official residence. As soon as President Pobre got out of the car, he began to talk to the secretaries beside him. His voice was low, but it was exceptionally clear and powerful. Just like him, it was filled with a steady vitality and trustworthy charm. After taking office for half a year, the change of personnel in the official residence was basically over. Now, the staff and officials closest to the president were some of Mr. Pobre's partners and subordinates when he was a lawyer. The burning dream of the past had become a reality today, and these people were his most loyal subordinates. There were also some officials recommended by various parties, especially those recommended by the Madam. However, the officials recommended by the Madam were mainly in the various departments and committees, and only one was left in the official residence. The office manager of the official residence, Bryn, came up to the president and whispered a few words in his ear. President Pobre's slightly thick lips curled up in a somewhat honest smile, making no effort to hide the joy in his heart. President Pobre walked into the oval-shaped office on the west side of the official residence, sat down on a chair, and carefully reviewed the prepared documents on the table. He signed his name, made a data save and authorization confirmation, and only then did he raise his head to look at the young man standing in front of the table. With a slight smile, he said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Su Lo." "It's my honor." Su Li's throat was a little dry as he stood ramrod straight. Looking at the president of the Federation in front of him, he replied, "It's my honor." For the matter of the new standards for the MX Mecca, he had once come to the president's official residence, but at that time, he had only waited in the lounge for a night. Now, he was actually standing in the legendary oval-shaped office, facing the most powerful man in the Federation. Fugitive, criminal, then meeting the president of the Federation face-to-face, even with Su Li's steady and resolute nature, he could not help but feel a sense of epiphany. He looked at the dark-faced President Pobre and knew that it was this president who had insisted on pardoning him. Thinking back to the many subtle connections he had with the presidential election in the past 2 years, he could not help but develop an extremely sincere and good impression of this middle-aged man. President Pobre leaned back in his chair and looked at the young man before him with great interest, his thick palms pressed together. He had already read too much of Su Li's files. On one hand, he was shocked by the deeds this young man had done, but on the other hand, he could not help but be a little puzzled. He clearly had a bright future ahead of him. Why would this person be willing to violate the laws of the Federation and kill Macklin? But when he saw Su Lo, he knew that he did not need to ask this question. This was because this young man's eyes were calm and honest, and his normal face naturally showed a look of determination and sincerity. He looked just like himself from many years ago. How many important figures of the Federation would think of their own past when they saw Su Lo? Would they think of their own clean and untainted past? The door of the office was pushed open, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miles, walked in under the guidance of Director Breen. In his hand was a small box wrapped in a sky-blue flannel cloth. General Miles looked at Su Lo and smiled, then walked to President Pobre's side and handed the box over. President Pobre stood up, opened the box, and took out a medal inside. He walked to Su Lo and put it on his left chest. He then patted his shoulder and said lightly, "Before you go out, remember to hide the medal. A hero like you probably won't be able to see the light of day for many years." Seeing the president himself, Su Lo self-deprecatingly realized that he was still nervous. At this moment, when he discovered that he had been awarded the Purple Star Medal, his pupils couldn't help but shrink, and the hands hanging outside his sleeve subconsciously clenched tightly. Killing Macklin, the Empire's most well-hidden spy, was naturally a great service to the Federation. However, he had never expected that, other than pardoning him, the military would also award him with an incredibly valuable medal. The MX Mecha was a success. I remember that you also have a medal. You can wear that one. President Pobre noticed Su Li's reaction and couldn't help but find it somewhat interesting. In a deep voice, he said, "Do well in the military from now on, and resist the Empire's invaders. The Federation needs people like you." Su Li glanced at the medal on his chest out of the corner of his eye. Thinking back to his conversation with Li Pifu in the prison that day, he vaguely understood the meaning of this medal. However, looking at the situation, even the president in front of him didn't know about the complicated relationship between himself and the Lis of Philadelphia. He stood at attention and saluted the president. President Pobre was the first president to come from Donglin. He didn't know that the young man in front of him was a fellow countryman, only thinking that Su Li had once been a mine maintenance soldier in Donglin. Naturally, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closeness. Smiling, he asked, "The military court sentenced you to 732 years in prison, but I never thought that what you did was wrong. The Federation can't give you glory under the sun, and I don't think you'll ask the Federation to compensate you for the 100 days you spent in prison. If you have any thoughts, you can say them now." General Miles stood to the side and smiled at Su Li. He didn't know what kind of request this young man would make to the president. "The assassination of Macklin wasn't done by me alone." Su Li didn't hesitate and blurted out, "I also have a partner. His name is Shi Qinghai. He played a very important role in killing Macklin. He should still be imprisoned in Fox Fortress right now. I sincerely ask that Mr. President grant him special amnesty." As soon as these words were said, the originally relaxed atmosphere in the Oval Office suddenly changed. General Miles frowned and glanced at Su Li. President Pobre walked back to his desk. After a moment of silence, he said, "If I remember correctly, this person called Shi Qinghai is an intelligence agent for the anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain." "I know, but I saw the news yesterday. I heard that Mr. President is preparing to restart negotiations with Green Dragon Mountain," Su Li replied with his head lowered. "The invasion of the Empire is imminent. The Federation needs to be united internally. I do intend to invite the leader of Nanshui to the capital for negotiations." 2 years ago, Mr. Pobre, who was still a member of Parliament, had reached an agreement with the anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain. Now that he was the president of the Federation, he naturally had to carry out this agreement. Although the government attributed Macklin's death to the fanatical terrorists of Green Dragon Mountain, it didn't affect the overall situation at all. President Pobre didn't need to explain anything to Su Li, but for some reason, looking at his resolute eyes, he admitted to this point. "The winter before last, when you went to S2, as well as the information transfer and negotiations, it was all facilitated by Shi Qinghai." Su Li added another bargaining chip. "You insist?" President Pobre looked at him with a heavy expression and asked. "I insist." Su Li raised his head and answered very seriously. Chapter 318. President Pobre was very different from his predecessors. For this politician, who was born at the bottom, the inherent traditions of the Federation were definitely not an untouchable iron curtain. Of course, as the current leader of the Federation, he was not so stupid as to completely ignore compromise and balance and want to blow up a strong wind in the universe. The changes he made were slow and careful. For example, the routine ball of the Nebula Award winners at the president's official residence was cancelled. Instead, the president personally attended the award ceremony and gave a passionate speech. Reverence was because of the power and authority that the president represented. Reverence was because of the political traditions of the Federation and the embodiment of the will of the Federation. The guests looked at President Pobre on the stage, but it did not prevent them from becoming more and more confused. Why did the president make such a sudden and temporary change to the Nebula Award ceremony? The content of President Pabre's speech revealed the real reason. The first half of the speech was very common. It was warm praise for the scientists and artists who had made outstanding contributions to the progress of the Federation. However, the second half of the speech began to become heavy and pointed. The guests listened to the speech in disbelief. They could understand the president's criticism of the empire, his concern for the situation in the West Woods, and his deep hatred for terrorist activities. However, they could not understand why the president's speech was not directed at the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain, but vaguely pointed at the dead senator and the special investigation that had once taken place. Even if they were election opponents, even if they had different political views, Senator Macklin was already dead. Furthermore, he was remembered and loved by many people in the Federation. Why did President Pabre do this? Where did his most basic political IQ go? After the speech, there was no mention of Macklin's name at all. However, the obscure and direct meaning could be understood by anyone. Below the stage, the governor of Jingzhou, Mr. Ross, who was holding the Peace Prize, had an extremely heavy and angry expression on his face. The dead were gone. Did President Pabre not know that this was a big taboo? The death of a person is not as good as the extinguishing of a lamp. The lamp has light, but the place it cannot illuminate is darkness. If you do something wrong, you have to pay the price. President Pabre looked at the guests who were looking at each other in bewilderment and said coldly, "Perhaps I am not a mature politician, but I am a devoted follower of the Federation's laws. If I die, you can dig up my grave and see what color it is inside. I have the same attitude towards certain dead people." The Nebula Awards ceremony ended in this strange atmosphere. The staff in the office were stunned and immediately started to work to ensure that Mr. President's speech would not be published in the newspapers. However, with so many guests present, the content of the speech would definitely be leaked out. As for whether it would cause any unrest in the Federation that had just been quiet, this was something that no one could predict at the moment. The guests and officials with serious expressions walked out of the George Carlin Center. The first thing they did was to collect the Capital Special District daily for the past week. The Federation seemed to want to do something about the dead Macklin. President Pabre mentioned the Capital Special District daily's investigation. Only then did people remember that Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood, who had just been discharged from the hospital, seemed to have returned to the newspaper that was famous for exposing the truth. The police car cleared the road, and the black presidential motorcade slowly drove into the official residence. As soon as President Pabre got out of the car, he began to give verbal instructions to the secretaries beside him. His voice was low, but it was exceptionally clear and powerful. Just like him, it was full of a steady vitality and trustworthy charm. After taking office for half a year, the change of personnel in the official residence was basically over. Today, some of the staff in the official residence were Mr. Pabre's partners and subordinates when he was a lawyer. The burning ideals of the past had become a reality today, and their loyalty and execution were unquestionable. There were also some officials recommended by various parties, especially the officials recommended by Lady Tai. These officials had been doing official work for many years, and their abilities were outstanding. They were also very experienced in dealing with the Senate, the media, and various organizations. However, the officials recommended by Lady Tai were basically arranged in important departments and several major committees. There was only one person left in the official residence. The office director of the official residence, Bryn, came up to Mr. President and whispered a few words in his ear. President Pabre's slightly thick lips slightly opened, and he smiled. He quickly walked into the oval-shaped office on the west side of the official residence, sat down on the chair, and carefully reviewed the prepared documents on the table. He signed his name, did the data storage, and confirmed the permissions. Then, he looked up and smiled at the young man standing in front of the table. He said, "Nice to meet you, Su Lo." "It's my honor." Su Li's throat was a little dry as he stood straight and looked at the president of the Federation in front of him. He had come to the official residence for the matter of the MX Mecha's new standards, but at that time, he had only waited for a night in the lounge. At this moment, he was standing in front of the most powerful man in the Federation, and was only 3 steps away. The previous strict inspection and the cold gaze of the only person who knew the inside story, the director of the Special Task Force, made Su Lo understand more deeply what it meant to meet Mr. President. A fugitive, a criminal, and then a personal meeting with the president. Even if he had a calm and determined temperament, he couldn't help but feel anxious. He looked at the tan President Pobre and thought of Mr. President's respectable past. He then thought of the many subtle relationships he had with the presidential election in the past 2 years, and how it was this president who insisted on pardoning him. He couldn't help but feel very sincere affection and respect for him. President Pobre leaned against the back of his chair and looked at the young man in front of him with great interest. He put his thick palms together. He had read too much about Su Li's files. On the one hand, he was shocked by the young man's abilities and achievements. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a little puzzled. He clearly had a bright future ahead of him, so why was this person willing to violate the laws of the Federation and kill Macklin? But when he saw Su Lo, he knew that he didn't need to ask this question. This was because this young man's eyes were calm and honest, and his normal face naturally showed a look of determination and sincerity. He looked just like himself many years ago. How many big shots in the Federation would think of their own past when they saw Su Lo? Would they think of their own clean and untainted past? The door of the office was pushed open, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miles, walked in under the guidance of Director Breen. He was holding a small box wrapped in a sky-blue velvet cloth. General Miles didn't look at Su Lo. He walked straight to President Pobre's side and handed the box over. President Pobre stood up and opened the box. He took out a medal from inside and walked over to Su Lo, placing it on his left chest. He then patted Su Li's shoulder and said casually, "Before you go out, remember to hide the medal. A hero like you probably won't be able to see the light of day for many years." Seeing the president himself, Su Lo found self-deprecatingly that he was still nervous. Now that he found that he had been awarded the Purple Star Medal, his eyes narrowed involuntarily, and the hands hanging outside his sleeves subconsciously clenched into tight fists. Killing Macklin, the Empire's most well-hidden spy, was naturally a great service to the Federation. However, he felt that he had only done it by accident. He would never have thought that, other than being pardoned, the Federation would also award him with an incomparably valuable medal. "You've done a great service to the Federation in developing the MX Mecha. I remember that you also have a medal. You can wear that one." President Pobre noticed Su Li's reaction and couldn't help but find it interesting. In a deep voice, he said, "Do well in the army from now on. Resist the Empire's invasion. The Federation needs people like you." Su Li glanced at the medal on his chest from the corner of his eye. Thinking back to his conversation with Li Pifu in prison that day, he vaguely understood the meaning of this medal. However, it seemed that the president in front of him didn't understand the complicated relationship between himself and the Lees of Philadelphia. He stood at attention and saluted the president. President Pobre was the first president to come from Donglin. He didn't know that the young man in front of him was from his hometown. He only knew that Su Li had once been a mine maintenance soldier in Donglin, so he naturally felt a sense of closeness. He smiled and asked, "The military court sentenced you to 713 years in prison, but I've never thought that what you did was wrong. The Federation is unable to honor you under the sun, and I don't think you'll ask the Federation to compensate you for the 100 days you spent in prison. If you have any thoughts, you can say them now." General Myers stood to the side and looked at Su Li. He didn't know what kind of request this young man would make to the president. The assassination of Macklin wasn't done by me alone. Sulu did not hesitate and blurted out, I still have a partner, his name is Hai. He was able to kill Macklin, he played a very important role in the middle, he should still be imprisoned in Fox Fort, I plead for Mr. President to pardon him. As soon as these words were said, the originally relaxed atmosphere in the Oval Office suddenly changed. General Myers frowned and glanced at Sulu. President Pobre walked back to his desk. After a moment of silence, he said, if I remember correctly, this person called Hai is an intelligence agent for the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain. I know, but I saw the news yesterday. I heard that you're preparing to restart negotiations with Green Dragon Mountain, Sulu replied with his head lowered. The invasion of the Empire is imminent. The Federation needs to be united internally. I do intend to invite the leader of Nanshui to the capital for negotiations. 2 years ago, Mr. Pobre, who was still a member of Parliament, had reached an agreement with the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain. Now that he had become the president of the Federation, he naturally had to carry out this agreement. Although the Federation attributed Macklin's death to the fanatical terrorists in Green Dragon Mountain, it didn't affect the overall situation at all. President Pobre didn't need to explain anything to Sulu, but for some reason, when he looked at Suli's determined eyes, he admitted to this point. 2 years ago, when you went to S2, as well as the information transfer and negotiations, it was all facilitated by Hai. In order to save Hai, Sulu had no choice but to reveal this little secret. Although Mr. Sher had once shouted that this was their president, as the president of the Federation, who would really care about these small details of the past. You insist. President Pobre looked at him with a heavy expression and asked. I insist. Sulu raised his head and answered very seriously. Chapter 319. President Pobre did not promise Sulu anything. Although he personally announced that Sulu was a Federation hero who could not see the light of day, he could not let Sulu ask for too much. Amnesty was not a small matter, not to mention that the target of the amnesty was an intelligence agent of the anti-government army. Mr. President had to consider the possible political risks this matter could bring. In another office of the president's residence, Sulu kept his head down as he signed legal documents. The Federation law allowed the president to grant amnesty, but the relevant legal procedures were extremely complicated. Although the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of National Defense had full authority to represent him in these legal procedures, the final signing and certification was not a small task. After signing the legal documents that were more than 10 centimeters thick, he was brought to another office. On the smooth black table, there were 2 thin documents. General Miles sat to the side, smoking a thick cigarette in his mouth. Several officers of the Ministry of National Defense were waiting for him. Sulu knew that only by signing these 2 documents would he be able to truly regain his freedom. He walked forward and carefully read the 2 thin documents. His eyes couldn't help but flash with a trace of doubt. After the conversation in prison, he originally thought that Army God Li Pifu had already seen through all of his details. The reason why the military supported the president's amnesty was because the military needed his special ability to enter the Empire as a spy and act as a suicide squad in this magnificent space war. However, he did not expect that these 2 documents did not include any content in this regard. They only required him to give up some related rights and accept any orders from the federal military at any time. Perhaps this clause already hid that meaning. He narrowed his eyes as he looked at the documents and thought that by signing these documents, he would become a soldier of the Federation for life. Not only would he have to obey military orders to the death like a soldier, but he might also be arranged to do some very strange things. He did not feel that this was unfair. 713 years of imprisonment was erased by Mr. President. It was natural for him to do something for the Federation. On the contrary, he felt that these conditions were too generous. You have a month's leave, then report to the Ministry of National Defense. As for who to report to, you know best. Admiral Miles put down the cigarette in his hand and said, I don't know why the commander appreciates you so much, but I don't want to see you die anyway. Sign the document and leave quickly. Shi Qinghai. Sula still didn't let go of this issue and said seriously, even if I sign the document, I may not fulfill my duties. If you don't fulfill your duties, the pardon will be automatically revoked, and you will be locked up in Fox Fort for 713 years. General Miles stared into his eyes like an eagle. I'm not afraid of being shut off. Sula smiled bitterly and began to write. After signing the thin document that was similar to a slave contract, it was obvious that both General Miles and the officers of the Department of Defense were relieved. As the number one figure in the federal military, whether it was giving Sulu an award, a special pardon, or signing the document at this time, General Miles should not have appeared at all. However, this was the task that his teacher had personally given him over the phone, so he had to be cautious. Kid, you are free, and you will never be free again. The officers of the Department of Defense took the document and walked out of the office with solemn expressions. General Miles walked out of the door and said in a deep voice. At the entrance of the President's official residence, General Miles left first. He had come to the Capital Special District from the 1st Military Region just for Su Li's matter. Su Li stood alone by the grass at the entrance of the President's official residence. He looked up at the sun and the sky and smelled the faint green fragrance of freshly cut grass. He was a little confused. After a while, he took off the medal on his chest and put it in his pocket, then walked out of the official residence. The Special Task Force agents in black formal suits around him did not know that this young soldier was the terrorist who hurt many colleagues at the S2 Foundation building half a year ago. After looking at him vigilantly, they watched him leave. Oh, he had no luggage on his back. He had no keys, no wallet, no bank card. He had nothing but a medal. He stood at the entrance of the President's official residence. The people coming and going did not recognize him. He did not know where he was going, because he did not even have the money to take the subway. Sulu looked up at the sky and thought for a while with narrowed eyes. Should he first contact Tai Yuan or Zhou Yu? The problem was, did he have to go into the official residence and borrow a phone from the President? At this time, a black car without a logo slowly drove over. The pass on the window made the security personnel around the official residence not have any emotional reaction. The window slowly rolled down, revealing Tai Yuan's pale and thin face. He smiled and said, "Lost?" "Well, a little." Sulu smiled happily and opened the door. Tai Yuan waved his hand and said, "You drive." Sulu was slightly stunned. He got into the familiar driver's seat and gently stroked the perfect steering wheel. He looked at the mini radar display window on the car computer and realized that it was his car. "Where are you going?" Tai Yuan was wearing a military uniform today. He leaned against the window and asked, "I want to go home and have a look." Sulu started the car and at the same time reached out his hand. "But I want to make a call first." Tai Yuan handed over the phone. Sulu dialed a familiar number. After pausing for a moment, he said into the phone, "Yuzi, I'm out." Tai Yuan, who was looking out the window, narrowed his eyes slightly, as if he was blinded by the blazing sun above the capital. Sulu did not care about his reaction. He said softly to Zhou Yu on the other side of the phone, "I'm sorry, that hooligan is still locked up. But they promised to do their best. Maybe he will be released soon." In the end, he said very seriously, "Thank you." The black car passed through the number 2 highway. Accompanied by the slight hum of the engine, the sunroof opened. The sun and the warm wind of late spring came in and sprinkled on Su Lu and Tai Yuan's upper bodies. The wind blew their hair. "It's easy to get sick when you're exposed to too much wind," Tai Yuan said. "You've been in the army for so long. Isn't your body stronger than before?" From Tai Yuan's military uniform and slightly changed temperament and facial color, Su Lu had long guessed where this guy had been hiding for more than a year. Su Lu had never cared about Tai Yuan's identity. He was the crown prince who was worshipped by most people in the Federation. He was only his friend, and the weaker one among his friends. This was because the crown prince's body was not very good. He had fainted in his arms before. "I can't believe you were promoted to a major so quickly. I've done so many things, but I'm still just a captain. I was trained in the military. In the Lufeng Slope Club, the lieutenant colonel epaulets were already prepared for you. But in the end, you ran to S2 to play the role of a lone hero." A faint mockery seeped out from Tai Yuan's hairy upper lip. He was younger than Su Lu, but that weak and inexperienced feeling had long been blown away by the wind and smoke of Green Dragon Mountain. All that was left was calmness and confidence. Su Lu raised his eyebrows and said, "I never wanted to play the role of a hero. Who knew that Macklin was actually a spy for the Empire? I admit, I'm just a guy with too much luck." He took out the medal from his jacket pocket and threw it over. Tai Yuan looked at the shining purple star medal in his hand and said with a sigh, "When Li Pifu was your age, he only had 2 purple stars on his chest." Su Lu smiled and didn't continue to discuss his own matters. He began to ask Tai Yuan about his life in the military for more than a year. He hadn't seen blood. Had he ever fired a gun? How did he get first place in the anti-terrorism exercise? And if there were any other girls besides Bai Qi? In the black car, cheerful laughter gradually sounded. Traveling in the free wind and sunshine, a young man had forgotten the darkness of blood and fire, and a young man had forgotten his identity and status. Just like in H1 a long time ago, through the intercom, they were talking about very interesting things. At the corner of the corridor, Su Lu took out a key and opened the door of Wang Du apartment. This was the first time Tai Yuan had come to this apartment. Like the owner of the place, he walked straight to the sofa and sat down. He seriously looked at the size and layout of the room. The air circulation system of the apartment had always been working well. Although no one had lived here for more than half a year, there was still no dust or dirt. Su Lu poured a cup of tea for Tai Yuan and then walked to the balcony. He looked at the green vines and leaves that had regrown and smiled slightly. Yuzi lived here after she got pregnant. Tai Yuan put down the teacup and suddenly asked. Yes, in June, the Zhou family took her back. Su Lu didn't turn around and said, "The key I took just now was prepared for her. She always likes to forget to bring her key when she goes out." Zhou Liuhua. I went to take a look. The little guy is quite good-looking. Tai Yuan's voice was like a riverbed that had been washed by water. It was a little rough. You said it's not yours. Then it's Shi Qinghai's. Su Lu turned around and said seriously, "You have nothing to do with Zhou Yu, right?" After a moment of silence, Tai Yuan smiled and said, "Indeed, but can you speak to me more politely? Although I didn't help you much this time, and Li Pifu inexplicably took a fancy to you, but, after all, I did want to do something. Is everything okay between you and your wife? We had a quarrel, but it's not a big problem. I didn't go back to Macho Mountain. Mother and son need to calm down for the time being." Tai Yuan said lightly, but Su Lu was very moved. In the end, he was too embarrassed to say anything related to gratitude. His smile gradually disappeared. He didn't need to think about what he would do after regaining his freedom or what the federal military would arrange for him. But he always remembered one thing and one person deeply. "Can you help me investigate a person?" Who? By Yuan. After a moment, Tai Yuan put down the phone, looked at him and said slowly, "Your secretary is in the capital. She's a member of Whitewater Group 7. She's holding a wedding ceremony tonight." Su Lu was silent for a moment. He walked into the kitchen and began to carefully grind a three-pointed fine-edged knife. Chapter 320. Tai Yuan walked to the door and saw Su Lu sharpening the knife by the sink. He frowned and said coldly, "You're going to make dinner for me personally. Should I feel honored?" He knew what Su Lu wanted to do, so he deliberately said this to dispel his thoughts. Su Lu also knew what he meant, so he didn't stop his hands. He lowered his head and let the thin water flow on the tip of the knife. He said softly, "I have something to do tonight, so I won't accompany you for dinner. Don't be so naive. You should think about why President Li Pifu, Pabre, is willing to stand up for you, instead of making a scene at the wedding to avenge yourself and Shi Qinghai." Tai Yuan frowned and said disapprovingly, "I don't want to make a scene, I just want to ask him face to face, and then, he has to give me back what he should give me back." Su Lu paused for a moment and said seriously. Tai Yuan looked at the firm lines on his side face and sighed softly. He thought that this guy's character hadn't changed at all. Even after experiencing so many major events and being locked in a dark prison for so long, he still didn't change at all. Once he set his mind on something, he would do it. He didn't look like a person who had just gotten freedom, who should be happy but still be afraid of self-control. That in the evening, the capital special district was bathed in the western sunset glow. The gentle spring breeze and blooming flowers and trees were showing off on both sides of the street. At the end of Lixing Avenue, one could faintly see the high-rise buildings in the city center in the distance and the aircraft gliding by from time to time. All kinds of cars were parked outside a seemingly inconspicuous hotel, and the three-dimensional ray color map at the entrance was constantly changing words and graphics. A black car was parked on the opposite side of Lixing Avenue. The window was rolled down, and one could faintly hear the wedding MC's voice and soft music. Su Lu squinted his eyes and looked over there. He noticed that most of the cars outside the hotel were military vehicles with special license plates of each state. The vehicles were covered with dust, so they must have just come here after a long journey. On the small light screen at the entrance of the hotel, in addition to the changing images and words, there was a row of words that had never changed: "Congratulations to Mr. Ning He and Miss Bao Xiaoli on their wedding, and may they grow old together. Ning He is by Yuan's sworn brother. They are both from the 17th Armored Division. Back then, on the mining planet in Bermuda, they saved each other's lives. Therefore, when Ning He gets married, your secretary has to be present. Maybe he doesn't know that you've been released from prison. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come back so openly." Tai Yuan put down the phone and told Su Lu what he had just heard. As the crown prince of the Tai family, even though he had a huge conflict with Macho, it was very easy for him to know the files and past of most of the people in the Federation. Sworn brothers. When Su Lu heard these 4 words, he thought of the train trip he and Bai Yulan took from the capital to Hong Kong every week last year. He thought of the seamless cooperation they had when they were developing the MX Mecha. He thought of the rashness at the old moon base and the silence outside the S24 States Peace Foundation building. He couldn't help but feel a little depressed. Tai Yuan's gaze lightly swept past the dusty license plates of the military vehicles at the entrance of the hotel. With his status, accompanying Su Lu to this place was already giving him enough face. However, when he thought of Su Li's personality, he couldn't help but say a few more words. Bai Yulan was expelled from the military court, so he joined Whitewater. But Ning He is different. He has always been in the military and is doing very well. Today, there should be quite a few officers from the 17th Armored Division here. These people have a good relationship with Bai Yulan. And those people from the 7th Armored Division. Bai Yulan isn't in active service, but after the incident with the 7th Armored Division, Bai Yulan took all the responsibility. The others didn't have anything to do with it. These people all follow Bai Yulan's lead, so I think they are all willing to give their lives for him. He pointed at the military vehicles and said, most of them are from the 1st Armored Division. Although they have returned to their respective units and become the trump cards of their respective units, they are still very much alive. But I think if anything happens to Bai Yulan, the speed at which they pull out their guns won't slow down at all. Su Le knew that Tai Yuan was warning him. In the Federation society, no matter how strong one's background was, if they were to encounter a group of red-eyed active duty officers, they would only be unlucky. This was also why Zhu dared to order the guards to open fire in Linhai State, while the second generation of the 7 great families were much more cautious. Since ancient times, the barrel of a gun had its own unique power and magic. I just wanted to ask him a few questions, Su Lu explained again. Tai Yuan thought to himself, then why did you sharpen your knife so hard? He said softly, the young officer is someone that many people want to win over. Bai Yulan is not an active duty soldier, but he has enough influence in this circle. Of course, this is what he deserves, because he has taken the blame for many of these soldiers, and saved their lives. I heard that Shunli sent a gift, so it seems that Bai Yulan's appearance is something that my mother has acquiesced to. I won't get involved in this matter, so be careful. Su Le nodded, opened the door, and walked out. He avoided the roaring cars on Lixing Avenue, walked past the dusty military vehicles, and stopped at the side door of the hotel. He raised his head and looked at the rotating words of blessing on the three-dimensional hologram. Through the glass, he looked at the couple on the stage who were smiling happily. His heart warmed slightly, and he decided to wait outside so as not to disturb some irrelevant people. The hotel where the ceremony was held was not very eye-catching, but the wine and food at the wedding banquet were quite good. The wild beef bought from the black market was served as complex protein meat, and the guests tasted it with satisfaction, tacitly silent. The HTD Bureau of the Federation still seemed to strictly enforce the wildlife protection law, but in fact, in many occasions, especially in many occasions in the capital, this law had become a cover. Major Ning, he was 31 years old this year. 2 years ago, he was transferred from the 8,384th Unit, which was the 17th Armored Division, to the office of the 1st Military Region's General Staff Officer. Now, he was already a Level 2 Combat Staff Officer. Although he was not a big shot, he had a very good future. At his wedding banquet, many important people from the military region were invited. In this kind of occasion, the HTD Bureau would not blindly carry out official business. According to the tradition of the Federation, Ning He and the bride drank wine and fed each other a piece of soft deep-sea shellfish meat, which represented their affection. The ceremony was almost done. After the chief made a speech on behalf of the staff officer's office, the guests began to eat happily, waiting for the couple to come forward and toast. After a busy day, Ning He felt a little tired, but as the groom, he couldn't let this tiredness show. He whispered something to the bride, then turned his head and saw a familiar figure in the side hall. A sincere smile appeared on his face. He and Bai Yulan had been comrades for many years. They were comrades who had squeezed into the same Mecca and trusted each other in life and death. Although the two of them had not seen each other much in the past few years, and because of the Whitewater Company case, Bai Yulan had deliberately distanced herself from them, but Ning He admitted that he still saw Bai Yulan as his most trusted partner. Today was his wedding day. If Bai Yulan was not here, it would be a regret that could not be made up for. Fortunately, he had rushed back. Ning He raised the empty glass in his hand towards the side hall and smiled. He noticed that Bai Yulan's smile was as calm as usual, but there was an unusual hint of heaviness between her brows. Ning He frowned slightly. He knew that Bai Yulan seemed to have been on some secret mission and caused some trouble. However, with his ability in the military region, he could not find any clues. The moment he turned his head, his gaze swept across the hotel's floor-to-ceiling window. He saw a person standing outside the window and couldn't help but freeze. The young man outside the hotel had an ordinary face and was dressed plainly. His slightly squinted eyes were faintly visible. He gave off an amiable feeling, like a passerby waiting for someone. But for some reason, Ninghe felt that this person was very dangerous, extremely dangerous. And the person he was waiting for was definitely someone at the wedding venue. Ninghe, who had survived the battle with the Empire in Bermuda, would not feel the slightest bit of fear because of the appearance of such a person. He just did not want to be disturbed at his wedding. He waved his hand and called for an officer in the side hall. He whispered a few words, and the officer's eyebrows twitched slightly. There was a hint of disdain and hatred in his eyes as he nodded. Su Lu did not want to disturb the most important day of a newlywed's life, so he obediently waited outside the hotel. He deliberately put some distance between himself and the entrance of the hotel. However, he did not know that his presence had already disturbed the other party. The sky gradually darkened, and the guests in the hotel had basically all left. Only a few tables of officers in the side hall, the soldiers who had gone through life and death with the groom, were still drinking. After going through all this with great difficulty, Ninghe smiled bitterly and cupped his hands in farewell. Surrounded by a group of people, he walked to the main entrance of the hotel and prepared to board the limousine and leave. Ninghe glanced out of the corner of his eye and saw that the eye-catching young man was still waiting in the distance. He lowered his head and said to the officer beside him, "I don't want to upset Xiaoli, so I'll go with her first." "You let Xiao Bai leave through the side door." "Lao Bai drank a little too much and won't leave," the officer said disdainfully. "What are you afraid of if you go through the front door? Today is your big day. I'll kill whoever dares to cause trouble. Don't worry, I'll take care of this." Ninghe smiled and said, "I'm just afraid that you'll make a big deal out of this." The officer beside him was called Xiong Lin Quan. He was the gunner of Team 7 back in the day. He had followed Bai Yulan to those remote mineral planets and killed countless pirates and Imperial Special Forces who had infiltrated. This person was fierce, and his methods of dealing with trouble were unusually direct and efficient. Ninghe had absolute faith in his abilities. It was just that this was a special day, so he said a few more words. From the bottom of their hearts, these soldiers did not think that the man in the distance was any real trouble, so they were not very worried. After a few words of idle chatter, the groom got into his wedding car and left amidst the cheers and jeers of the bride's sisters. Watching the newlyweds' motorcade leave the hotel, Su Lu, who had been standing there for a long time, sighed softly. He did not feel too much regret, but he did feel a little envious. 2 years ago, he had made a lot of warm life plans. He wanted to marry Zhang Xiaoming, have children, buy a house, and work. Who would have thought that his life would turn into such a strange shape? He had become a stranger to that beautiful girl and he rarely thought of her recently. Earlier, too many guests had come out of the hotel, so he had retreated to the corner of the street. At this time, he was about to take a few steps toward the front door when he unexpectedly saw a few officers in dark green military uniforms walking directly toward him. "What do you do?" Xiong Lin Quan asked with a cold face. The coldness and arrogance in his bones were obvious, and he had not trimmed them in the slightest. "I'm waiting for someone," answered Su Lu. "Who are you waiting for?" Su Lu said with a smile, "By Magnolia." After a moment of silence, the officers frowned at the same time. No matter how unreasonable a soldier was, it was impossible for them to directly wave their fists and hit someone on the streets of the capital, so Xiong Lin Quan suppressed his temper and asked a few questions. He did not expect this person to answer so simply and directly. It turned out that this guy was really here to cause trouble for Lao Bai. After confirming this, Xiong Linquan and the officers beside him did not have the slightest bit of vigilance. Instead, they felt a little happy. There were not many opportunities to solve problems for Lao Bai. If it were based on their nature, they would be willing to knock this young man to the ground, step on him a few times, spit on him, and then drag him to the hotel like a dead dog and let him lie at Lao Bai's feet. However, before Ning He left, Xiong Linquan had already told him not to do anything, so he did not do anything. He only coldly raised his chin and lightly waved the index finger of his right hand. Today, we're holding a joyous occasion here. You don't have to wait anymore. If you want to die for Lao Bai, come back another day. These soldiers could feel the danger that Su Li's calm represented, but they did not care because their lives were always accompanied by danger. Moreover, today, the 17th Armored Division and the fierce figures of the 7th Squad were gathered in the hotel. If Ning He was personally handling this matter, perhaps he would not have added those last provocative words, but Xiong Linquan was not this kind of person. Su Li did not react to these words, only smiling. As the technical director of the 7th Squad, although the 7th Squad had long been in a semi-disbanded state, and although he had not seen a single member of the squad, he had seen the files and knew the character and ability of this officer in front of him. His calmness in front of Xiong Linquan was a provocation. Xiong Linquan tilted his head and moved extremely close to him. He extended his right index finger and pointed it at the other's eyes. He said softly with a smile, "If I had a gun, would have shot you. The problem is that I'm here to attend a wedding. According to the rules, I can't bring a gun, so I can't shoot you. If you make a move, I'll smash you into pieces. The problem is that you're definitely going to dress as a woman, and there are also Federation laws, so I can't beat you up." Xiong Linquan straightened his body, looked at Su Lu with slight mockery, and said, "What happens next will definitely be a little interesting." After saying this, he tidied up his military uniform, turned around, and left, not paying any more attention to Su Lu. Su Li's brows furrowed slightly. Looking at this person's back, a trace of alarm appeared in his heart. With a loud roar of the accelerator, a dark green military vehicle suddenly started. It vibrated and rushed directly from the road onto the sidewalk, brushing past Xiong Linquan's side and crashing towards Su Lu. The military vehicle started so violently that the dust on the dark green body of the vehicle trembled. Like an arrow released from a bow, it slammed into Su Li's body. In an instant, the hard lines of the vehicle were only a few meters away from Su Lu. He couldn't shoot, so it was inconvenient for him to make the first move. Then, a traffic accident would happen. In this instant, Su Lu understood what the other was trying to do. His pupils constricted slightly as he looked at the military vehicle coming toward him, but his feet were as steady as iron and didn't move at all. Accompanied by the smell of burning and the sharp and short sound of brakes, the dark green military vehicle came to an abrupt stop. The bottom metal plate at the front of the vehicle was less than half a meter away from Su Li's knees. Su Lu didn't move. It wasn't because he didn't react in time, but because there was probably no one in the Federation with a faster reaction time than him. It wasn't that he wanted to pretend to be calm and indifferent and ignore the dangerous aura of the military vehicle just now. It was because after experiencing so many major events, his state of mind was strong enough to know that the other was just trying to scare him. Most importantly, he knew his own body well. This body was becoming more and more like the number one machine that the uncle had once mentioned. Even if the military vehicle didn't stop just now, he had enough time to dodge, or even counterattack. Xiong Linquan and the other officers turned around with disdainful smiles. They were prepared to see Su Lu fall to the ground in fear, or even go limp. However, they didn't expect to see Su Lu still standing in front of the military vehicle. He didn't move at all. Other than his eyes narrowing even more than before, there was no reaction at all. The expressions of Xiong Linquan and the other officers suddenly became serious. Previously, they weren't worried that there would be any accidental injuries because the one driving the military vehicle now was Lu Jiao. Lu Jiao was in charge of all the transfer procedures of Team 7. There was nothing that he didn't know how to drive or that he couldn't drive. However, they didn't expect that Su Le wouldn't react in the slightest under the threat of a military vehicle driven by Lu Jiao himself. Earlier, on the other side of the street, Tai Xuan had mentioned these military vehicles to Su Le. Su Le narrowed his eyes and looked at the stern face of the thin officer in the driver's seat through the glass window. He tried to compare the other person with Team 7's files. There were many special passes pasted on the dark green military vehicle, which meant that this military vehicle could be arrogant and fearless. At this time, the vehicle and the people were almost touching. The military vehicle was still roaring non-stop, arrogantly charging forward and stopping. It was like a fierce tiger preparing to leap out of the grass, as if it was ready to knock Su Le down to the ground and crush him into a pulp. A loud roar sounded in front of them. Su Le narrowed his eyes and looked at the military vehicle in front of him. He immediately recognized that the engine of this military vehicle was the V-25 model, and it had been modified. It didn't use a hybrid power output, but used a pure concentrated fuel system. Its acceleration was extremely fast, and the body frame of the vehicle had 3 levels of reinforcement. Under certain special circumstances, it could even be used as an armored collision vehicle. If such a military vehicle were to crash into a person's body, what would the consequences be? Amidst the roaring sound of the accelerator, Su Le glanced at Xiong Linquan, who had already turned around. He noticed that this person's eyes flashed with a hint of fierceness. At the same time, Lu Jiao's expression also turned cold in the military vehicle. They confirmed that Su Le was a dangerous program, and they confirmed that this person was here to cause trouble for Lao Bai, so their hearts suddenly turned cold. They wanted to help Lao Bai get rid of this trouble before it happened. It seemed that all they needed to do was to step on the accelerator. Su Le had to admit that the driving skills of the person in the military vehicle in front of him had reached the pinnacle, but he also had to admit that the original members of Team 7 were very capable and qualified to be arrogant. Hearing the roaring sound of the accelerator, feeling the arrogance and coldness of the other party, and feeling the danger, Su Li's back faintly felt numb and itchy, as if all 56,000 hairs on his body were standing on end at the same time. This feeling instantly turned into a burning sensation that filled Su Li's entire body. He took a step back without thinking, and then, under the gazes of the officers in front of him, he raised his right leg and kicked down. When the military boot landed on the military vehicle, a crack appeared on the sole of the boot. As the crack slowly expanded, a loud boom was heard from it. The dark green military vehicle was slightly shaken by the kick, and the hard front panel was slightly deformed. The central control computer on the vehicle let out a sharp warning sound, and the hood of the vehicle suddenly tilted up and slammed into the sky. White smoke rose from the front engine compartment, and the engine was immediately turned off. The next moment, Lu Jiao ran down from the military vehicle and slammed the door with force. She ran to the front, not paying attention to Su Le, who had just retracted his leg. She just stared dumbfoundedly at the place where the white smoke was everywhere. She did not think that she had wanted to kill that guy earlier. She only felt that her mind was a little confused, and she felt that everything she saw was fake. The expressions of Xiong Linquan and the other officers also became very interesting. In an instant, their faces turned white and then black as iron. They were different from Lu Jiao. They were all combat personnel. Although they were shocked by Su Li's terrifying kick, they immediately thought of preparing for battle. Who the fuck is this person? What kind of leg is this? Xiong Linquan thought in his heart. After being in the military for so many years, he had seen many powerful special forces soldiers. However, other than the few people who were rumored to be gods at the front line of the West Woods, where had he seen such a fierce person in real life? Although he was a little confused, his hands did not slow down. He had already reached for the gun at his waist. The Federal Army regulations strictly prohibited the carrying of firearms when going out in private. However, he was a gun fanatic and still carried a pistol. At this moment, he was a little doubtful that he could knock down the person in front of him with just a pistol. It seemed like he should have brought a Cayenne over. Seeing that the soldiers in front of him were preparing to take out their guns, Su-lo narrowed his eyes. The muscles behind his calves bunched up. Just as he was about to pounce over and knock down the person, he heard a familiar voice. "Put away your gun. If you don't want to die, this is the officer." He had not heard this voice for half a year, but it was still so soft and gentle. Just like every day last year, she stayed by Su Li's side, asking him what kind of tea he wanted to drink and where to put his clothes. Chapter 321. Whether it was guilt, fear, or the desire to use the wine in his glass to commemorate Su-lo, who he thought was dead, Bai Yulan drank a lot at his brother's wedding. People who drank tended to sweat easily. His sweat dampened a few strands of black hair on his forehead, like dewdrops sliding down the willow branches and into the lake. Bai Yulan was not a dazzlingly handsome man like Shi Qinghai and young Master Li. He just blindly hid his murderous intent with gentleness. His black hair scattered in front of his smooth forehead, drawing out a few pieces of complicated and shocked expression in his eyes. After quietly leaving the mountain behind the Golden Foundation building, he thought Su-lo was dead for sure. After all, the Black Prison and Special Amnesty were classified secrets of the Federation. He was just a chess piece placed by the big shots beside Su-lo, so he didn't know what had happened. Only now, outside the hotel, seeing Su-lo slowly retract his right leg, did he know that Su-lo was still alive. This is good, Bai Yulan thought to himself. He walked past Xiong Linquan and stood in front of Su-lo. He said softly, "Hello, boss." Hearing the word boss, Su Li's lips curved into a slight smile. His gaze didn't fall on Bai Yulan's face, because he didn't know what would happen if he looked at him a few more times. He looked at the officers behind Bai Yulan, who were on high alert, and said with narrowed eyes, "Now it seems that what you said when I first entered Whitewater was not false at all. Team 7 really is yours." Bai Yulan didn't answer, only standing quietly in front of him. The officers who were preparing to draw their guns found the atmosphere to be a little strange. They didn't move for a moment, only staring warily at Su-lo. Another person that Su-lo recognized ran out of the hotel. It was Lon Xiaolong, who had once been in charge of protecting Su-lo. Lon Xiaolong was Bai Yulan's comrade in the 17th Armored Division. He had once participated in the development of the MX Mecha. Although he didn't know what had happened after that, he knew very well that the problem between Su-lo and Bai Yulan wasn't something he could interfere with. With a solemn expression, he said a few words to the officers and drove them far away. However, if blood really did appear later, these people would definitely not stand by and watch. "How about we find a quiet place to talk?" Bai Yulan didn't ask how Su-lo managed to get out of the military prison alive, nor did she try to escape. She just calmly asked for instructions, just like she had done many times in the past. "This place is pretty good." Su-lo lowered his gaze, looked at him and said, "I just want to ask you a few questions." "Go ahead and ask. Since it's already come to this, I'm sure you know that there's no need for me to lie to you." Bai Yulan used her fingers to gently push away the wet hair in front of her face. She put her hands into her pockets and looked up calmly. Su-lo was silent for a moment, then suddenly asked, "The people lying in the hospital are your parents, right?" Bai Yulan's expression froze slightly, then she slowly replied, "Yes. You were really sent to the military court because of your illegal activities. Yes. Do you really love money that much? Yes. Did I give you 20 million? Yes. Are all the things you told me true? Su stared into his eyes and asked. After that, I kept asking myself, what exactly is true and what is false? Everything I told you is true, but there are some things that I didn't tell you. Including that day when we went up the mountain. When I asked you to leave for the last time, you said that you wanted to go crazy with me. Bai Yulan was silent for a long time, then said, yes, that's what I thought at that time. Su looked at him silently. He didn't ask why he left and gave his hands to death. He looked down at his toes, smiled helplessly, then sighed and said, you said that you were the person who loved and respected money the most, but that time you wanted to go crazy with me. I thought that was true. In the past, when we went to Hong Kong every week, you helped me get rid of trouble, and you helped me test the plane. You've already helped me a lot. 20 million is more or less. That time outside Flowing Wind Slope, when I set my mind to do that thing, I didn't take your weight into account, but you insisted on going with me. To be honest, I was very touched at that time. I felt that you finally didn't treat me as a boss, but as a friend. The assassination of Macklin was a highly confidential and magnificent project. Su had insisted on not letting Bai Yulan follow because he didn't want to drag him into this mess. But in the end, Su took him with him, which represented how much reliance and trust he had. Unfortunately, in the end, when Red Leaf's gunshots rang out, this person disappeared without a trace, ruining the overall plan, cutting off Su Li's escape route, and exposing his back to the malicious eyes. Let's not talk about friendship and nonsense. When Su used this tone to speak, it meant that his mood was extremely gloomy, but he still lowered his head and looked at his toes. He said, in the hospital and in the company, you repeated to me that you are a very professional person. You only care about money and not people. You called me boss and said that you would sell your life to me. Is there anything you can explain? Bai Yulan laughed self-deprecatingly. His smile was actually a little cold. After a moment of silence, he replied, do you remember that I once told you that if both of us paid, I would have to follow a first-come, first-served basis? I originally thought that the other side wouldn't give me any instructions, but I treated it as reality, so I followed you up that mountain. But when I was on the mountain, I received the other side's instructions. So Lady Tai beat me to it. Su looked at his toes and smiled uncomfortably. After being locked up in the black prison of Fox Fortress for more than 100 days, other than chatting with that old thing, he spent most of his free time reminiscing about the details of this operation and the more distant days. Bai Yulan's departure was a devastating blow to the plan to assassinate Macklin. If it wasn't for the Federation's the glory of the charter shining into Su Li's black eyes at the most desperate moment, he and Shi Qinghai would probably have died a long time ago. After thinking about it carefully, Su couldn't find a reason why Bai Yulan would betray him. After being together for such a long time, he thought that he understood this delicate man very well. It wasn't until he looked forward for a long time that he finally understood the reason behind it. Being able to get to know Bai Yulan and take in this fierce and delicate man who was good at assassinating security guards as his assistant had happened after Su entered the 7th Combat Team of Whitewater Company. And when he entered Whitewater Company, it was after the data dispute in the laboratory that the Tai family had moved him away from the center of the storm. In other words, his meeting with Bai Yulan had been arranged by Big Secretary Shin. Looking at the source, all his questions were answered. Bai Yulan was, and had always been, a spy planted by the Tai family by his side. At the back of Macho's mountain, Su had said that he would work with the Tai family. How could the Chinchur Tai family be at ease with working with him? From that moment on, Su had been developing the MX Mecha and going to the Old Moon base for more than half a year. His whereabouts and details were all under Lady Tai's watch. But at that time, both sides had the same interests, so this cooperation didn't cause any problems. Until the Flowing Wind Slope Club, when Su Lu was determined to kill Macklin, Bai Yulan didn't know why, but she didn't send this vague judgment back to Macho's mountain. Until the last moment, when Lady Tai laid down this foreshadowing, Bai Yulan floated away, and Su Lu fell into a dead end. The front cover of the dark green military vehicle was tilted up, and the sound of the siren covered the conversation between the two people. The officers who were attending the wedding were vigilantly surrounding the periphery, looking at Bai Yulan and Su Li's figures with suspicion and nervousness. But at this time, the white smoke billowed, and the two figures were somewhat blurry. Everyone has their own principles. I accept this. Su Lu raised his head and said in a low voice, "You took Lady Tai's money first, and you follow the principle of first come, first served. I accept that. Even if you took the money and didn't work with your life, I also accept that. But you joined in and sold me out. This I can't accept." Hearing these words, Bai Yulan just kept silent. Her slightly wet black hair swayed in front of his eyes like a good hypnotist, making him fall into a strange state of mind. In the building, I was shot 14 times. The hard ceramic bulletproof vest you found for me was very good. There were 4 holes, but there were no major problems. Su Lu stared at her eyes under the black hair, and his voice was very faint and distant, but that was 14 times. I lost a lot of blood, and a lot of bones were broken. I almost died. In fact, I thought I was going to die that time. Su Lu was severely injured in the Golden Foundation building. If he didn't have the vitality of a crustacean, even if the medical soldiers of the 2nd Military Region saved him in time, he probably would have died. Even if he was still alive, he should be lying on a white hospital bed right now. He wouldn't be able to stand in front of Magnolia Orchid like he was right now. He wouldn't be able to talk about what happened to him with a lonely voice. I still have a brother who is now being detained by the Federation government. I don't know how long he can last. Su Lu said very seriously, "We didn't die. Logically speaking, I should feel lucky and then forget everything about you. After all, we didn't die. If he died, I would definitely kill you. If I died, he would probably kill you too. But you stabbed me." Su Lu narrowed his eyes and said, "You stabbed me hard in the back. It hurts, so I'm not in a good mood. That's why I came to find you today." Was this pain a physical pain, or was it the pain of betrayal? Su Lu didn't say anything. His narrowed eyes were full of seriousness. But Bai Yulan heard it clearly. She sighed softly in her heart. Just like what she said to Su Lu in the past, the life experience since childhood and the cruel life after joining the army made her not have many warm feelings for the world, except for the comrades who went through life and death with him and the silent but very amiable money. However, following Secretary Shin's instructions and following Su Li's side for so long, Bai Yulan's reserved ideals were also imperceptibly changing. She had never met a person as simple, direct, and pure as Su Lu. She originally thought that by following Su Lu, she would also be a little more simple, direct, and pure. In the end, she didn't expect that things wouldn't go as she wished. In the end, she was still a monitor, a sharp chess piece. Bai Yulan was silent for a moment. Then, she took her right hand out of her trouser pocket. Holding a delicate knife between 3 fingers, she used the sharp edge of the knife to gently push away the wet black hair above her eyes. Looking at Su Lu, she said very seriously, "Stab me back." Within the circles of the 17th Armored Division and Whitewater's 7th Combat Team, Bai Yulan, who had once served as the captain of the Special Knife Team, was, without a doubt, an extremely powerful figure. Officers who were older than her called him Little White. Most of the soldiers respectfully called him Old White, regardless of whether he was in active service or not. However, everyone knew that the White Magnolia had another nickname, and that was magnolia oil. This was because he was the most terrifying veteran on the battlefield. Even if he didn't have any firearms in his hands, he could kill 3,000 enemies just by relying on that delicate little knife that never left his side. That was enough to kill 3,000 enemies. Through the white smoke, the scattered officers on the sidewalk noticed that Bai Yulan had taken out his military knife. Their expressions instantly tensed up, and they slowly closed in on the two, ready to strike at any moment. However, Sula didn't seem to have noticed the tense atmosphere outside. Looking at the delicate knife in Bai Yulan's hand, he thought of the dangerous encounter he had with this person for the first time in the Whitewater Company. He also thought of the mecha piloting skills Bai Yulan had imparted to him in the underground base. His heart didn't soften, but he felt slightly frustrated. He simply wanted to trust someone. He had done this since he was young. However, this kind of trust was always easily blown away by the strong winds of the Federation, leaving no traces behind. After a moment of silence, he pulled out the three-edged knife that he had been sharpening for half an hour from behind his waist. He said to Bai Yulan, "Your knife is too small. It won't hurt enough to stab someone." Bai Yulan smiled. Her bright eyes seemed to be able to burn the black hair in front of her. With a squelch, the sharp three-edged knife pierced deeply into Bai Yulan's back. Sula slowly let go of his hand and took a step back. Looking at the blood between his thumb and forefinger, he remained silent. Bai Yulan turned around. His facial muscles twitched painfully a few times. Looking at his pale face, he shook his head and said, "After following you for so long, I know that you have one biggest weakness. You look quite ruthless, and sometimes you can kill without batting an eyelid. However, as long as you meet someone you know, it's basically very difficult for you to do it." Sula didn't say anything. He only extended his hand, spread it in front of him, and said, "Return that bank card to me. We're even." Bai Yulan shook his head with some difficulty and said softly, "I spend money very quickly. Let me owe you another life." Sula was silent for a moment, then laughed self-deprecatingly and said, "If you owe me a life, I'm afraid that in the future, I'll be the one who owes you a life." After saying this, he turned and left. He walked across the street and got into the black car. The surrounding officers gathered around. Although they had already seen that this matter was very strange, and that Bai Yulan didn't resist at all in the end and allowed the young man to stab him, at this moment, when they saw the blood flowing from Lao Bai's back and that terrible wound, they still felt their blood rush up and were ready to do something. "Take it back!" Bai Yulan roared angrily. He looked at the back of the man on the other side of the street. Enduring the pain, he said in a low and trembling voice, "He is Sulu. I owe him." After saying this, he fell down. Foam of blood spurted out from between his lips. The knife that had pierced into his back had already injured his lung. The injury was very serious. Chapter 322. Years ago, on a remote mineral star at the border between the West Woods region and Bermuda region, Whitewater Company's Team 7 was carrying out a secret mission. Bai Magnolia was hit in the chest by a piece of hard fiber shrapnel. His ribs were cut open, and blood flowed out like a stream. However, despite suffering such heavy injuries, Bai Yulan didn't make a single sound. She didn't even frown as she led the members of Team 7 to maintain a semicircle defensive formation. Relying on the Federation's advanced weapons and their valiant determination, they successfully held on until reinforcements arrived. For a full 16 minutes, Bai Magnolia, who was wearing a full-body isolation suit, stood behind the self-propelled armored vehicle. He did not retreat a single step until the wide-winged space fighter glided over. Only then did he collapse. That scene fell into the eyes of Xiong Linquan, Lu Jiao, and the rest of Team 7's combat personnel. It was deeply engraved in their minds until today. So when they saw By Magnolia collapse on the street, the anger in their hearts suddenly erupted. The cold murderous intent in their hearts rose to an uncontrollable level. Even with Lan Xiaolong's strict suppression, they could not control it. In the end, the reason why they calmed down a little was because of By Magnolia's words. That person was Su Lo. The tip of the knife had injured his lung. It seemed to be a serious injury, but for someone like By Magnolia who was born in the military, it was just a small surgery. He quietly laid on the hospital bed and signaled Lan Xiaolong beside him to turn off the automatic electronic anesthesia pump. He frowned and said in a hoarse voice, "Help me light a cigarette." After bleeding so much and undergoing surgery, the first thing a seriously injured person said after waking up was to smoke. The silent people in the ward did not express any shock. For these people in the ward, injuries were a common occurrence. But everyone felt that the knife that Lao Bai was stabbed with today was somewhat indescribable. What was even stranger was that these people in the ward knew very well that By Magnolia had stopped smoking after his failed experiment last autumn and was sent to the military court. Why did he want to smoke today? Xiong Linquan lit a cigarette and took 2 puffs to make it burn brighter. He silently put the cigarette between his thin lips. After a moment of hesitation, he asked, "Is that kid really Su Lo?" By Magnolia lay on the bed. Other than the new wounds that had been glued together by physiological glue, there were also many old scars on his bare back. He took a puff of his cigarette and said faintly, "During last year's gathering, I told you that if the Department of Defense and the company really wanted to reorganize Team 7, he would be the most important person. He is the leader that I found for everyone." A strange emotion flashed across Xiong Linquan's face. He opened his mouth slightly as if he wanted to curse, but in the end, it only turned into a sigh. Last year, during a few of their occasional gatherings, Bai Yulan had seriously mentioned the current technical director of Team 7. Her words were filled with sincere praise, admiration, and love. After hearing this many times, they naturally started to believe her. Now, Su Lo and I are the only 2 people left in Team 7. He is the technical director, and I am his secretary. By Magnolia said softly, "Unfortunately, there won't be such a pairing in the future." Xiong Linquan, Lu Jiao, and the rest of the people in the room fell silent. The federal military was a place that valued strength and respected the strong. As the combat director of Team 7, By Magnolia was once the most outstanding soldier in the federal military. She had given Su Lo such high praise, which naturally made them believe her. However, they didn't understand. Lao Bai clearly liked that young man very much, so why did something like this happen today? Lao Bai didn't even fight back. What exactly happened? Su Lo has a good personality. He treats people well and is very strong. Plus, he has a background in the Department of Defense. I thought that Team 7 would be the best choice to follow him. By Magnolia flicked away the ash from her cigarette and said softly, "Unfortunately, it looks like the military will definitely not let you all come back. He must be very disappointed in me. This team will be disbanded in the end." For Bai Yulan and the rest of the people in the room, Team 7 was the place where they had fought and lived. It was their truest history. They constantly wanted the Ministry of Defense to rescind the original order and rebuild Team 7, but all of this seemed so illusory. That Su Lo, is he really the developer of the MX Mecha? Why didn't I see him at the unveiling ceremony of the assembly line last month? Lu Jiao asked with a frown. In fact, he had never doubted By Magnolia's praise of that young man, but he just found it somewhat unbelievable. By Magnolia naturally wouldn't tell him that at that time, Su Lo had still been locked up in a dark military prison. Xiong Linquan sighed and said, "If you hadn't said it yourself, I really wouldn't have believed that this seemingly normal guy could actually operate a mecha and kill that young lieutenant colonel from the military god's family on the summit of Mount Kaki." Lan Xiaolong, who had been silent all this time, suddenly said, this is a military secret. It's best not to talk about it. Xiong Lin Quan laughed coldly and said, this kind of thing can't be hidden for too long. Lon Xiaolong smiled. Just as he was about to say something, the phone in his hand rang. He walked out of the door. By Magnolia, who was lying on the hospital bed, threw away the cigarette butt in her hand. After a moment of silence, she said softly, what a pity, what a pity. What's a pity? Asked an officer. A pity that Team 7 is disbanded just like that. It's one less person who was destined to be the most ferocious person to go to the front lines, or even to the Empire to do some of the most ferocious deeds. By Magnolia said softly, such a loyal unloyal boss, fuck, it would be hard to find a second one in the entire Federation. Lon Xiaolong pushed open the door and entered. He looked at By Magnolia with a strange expression, his hand still holding the encrypted military phone he always carried with him. Everyone in the room felt that something was wrong with him, and they all looked over. Lon Xiaolong looked at the outstanding officers in the room, who had been through the flames of war, and shrugged helplessly. He said, this is the first news that just came out. The War Strategy Office of the Ministry of Defense has issued a written order. The Whitewater Company's Team 7 is officially reorganizing. The transfer order should be on its way to your unit right now. As soon as he said this, the atmosphere in the room suddenly became a little strange. The officers in the room had all fought in Team 7. In the relatively peaceful era, they had fought a life-and-death battle with the Empire's invaders. Although now they were the trump cards of their respective units, as soldiers of the Federation, in the quiet night, how could they not miss the starry battlefields, the mines, the bullet holes, and the past battle scenes? By Magnolia's delicate eyes flashed with a glimmer of light. She asked softly, you're now just a colonel in the garrison area. The Ministry of Defense can't possibly inform you. Lon Xiaolong shrugged again, somewhat innocently. He adjusted his military cap and said, remember my mission in Harbor City last year? I was responsible for protecting a certain chief. By Magnolia's eyes grew brighter and brighter. She asked, who's the new leader of Team 7? Su Lo. Lon Xiaolong smiled and replied, but it's estimated that there will be an expansion because it seems that the 83-84 division will also be transferring people over. The entire reorganization timetable will take about 3 months. Everyone in the room finally understood what he was talking about. The shock in their hearts could not be erased. Instead, there was a trace of doubt. Even the 17th Armored Division would be transferring people over. What exactly did the Ministry of Defense want to do by reorganizing Team 7? The Capital Special District was just like the other places in the Federation. There were rich and poor like the clouds in the sky, and poor like the black mud. In the barren world of the Donglin District, there were also extremely luxurious nightclubs. In this city, which was the center of the Federation, there were not only places like Linyuan and the Windy Slope Club, but also small restaurants on the streets. To be precise, Sulo had been released from prison for less than 24 hours, but he had already done a lot of things. He had obtained a special pardon from the president, signed a contract to sell himself to the federal military, and even stabbed someone in the back. At this moment, he was sitting on a chair and taking big mouthfuls of vegetables in sesame oil from the pot. He was sweating profusely and seemed to be very happy. Shi Ziyuan wasn't used to eating in this kind of place. He frowned and looked at the oil stains and stains on the table. He then looked at the pile of food in the big pot. He really didn't have much of an appetite. After being locked in prison for 5 months, what I want to eat the most is something hot or even hot. It's best if it can burn my cold stomach until it hurts. Sula put down his chopsticks and explained with a smile. You probably don't want to think about the things I want you to think about. Li Pifu, President, the military, and the others bailed you out. What exactly do they want you to do? Do you know? In front of Su Lu, Tai Xuan did not look like the son of a noble family, but the environment he grew up in made him look so elegant when he wiped the corners of his mouth with a paper towel in this small restaurant. However, it was this kind of elegance that was too inconsistent with the environment that Su Lu could not help but laugh. After going through so many things, Su Li's state of mind had changed a lot. He was gradually returning to the orphan from Donglin's Zhonglo Street. Perhaps he did not need to pick up that broken but sharp hydraulic pipe anymore. His state of mind had already returned to that murderous, rainy night. He was still as persevering, stubborn, and cheerful as before. The silence that covered his face was gradually disappearing, and the blocks in his heart turned into sharp stones. Pressing forward courageously was not because he could not see ahead. Although he was a little confused about his future life, the biggest fear and apprehension since escaping from Donglin had disappeared. His identity as a fugitive from the Federation and his secret had already been caught. It was unnecessary to be nervous and silent. It was like an old scar that was always itching. Once it was abruptly removed, although it hurt a little, it was also exceptionally satisfying. Moreover, the Federation's war god seemed to have become his distant relative. He no longer needed to constantly worry about his identity as a fugitive. How could a cheerful young man like Su Lu not be sunny? His eyes were smiling like the two moons in the sky. He said, "Why do you care so much? At most, the Ministry of Defense will send me to the front lines as cannon fodder. If I can kill a few more Empire people, it won't be too much of a loss. After all, I should have been a dead man to begin with. I think the government won't spare a mecha genius like you from being cannon fodder." Tai Xuan looked at the narrowed eyes of Su Lu in front of him with slight ridicule, and his heart warmed a little. There were still a lot of inside stories that he had not figured out. What was the reason for Li Pifu to come out of seclusion? Why did his mother want him to die? And why was he still alive? Because of all these, Su Li's smiling face seemed somewhat mysterious at this moment. However, as a friend, he did not want to find out what was underneath the mystery. "The government is about to make a big move," Tai Xuan suddenly said. Su Lu understood the abilities of this young man in front of him very well. He knew that the big move he was talking about was definitely not a small matter. In an instant, the bustling little restaurant seemed to have quietened down. He raised his head seriously. "To be precise, it's Mr. Pobre. This big move is related to Green Dragon Mountain. Is there going to be a war?" Su Lu asked worriedly. Ever since they found out about Macklin's true identity, anyone who knew the inside story was shocked and fearful of the Empire's ambitions and foresight. The Federation now needed unity more than ever before. If the government attacked Green Dragon Mountain again, who knew what kind of negative effects it would bring? It might even give the Empire some opportunities to take advantage of. No, it's a negotiation. It's to implement the agreement at the end of last year. Tai Xuan shook his head. Sitting at the simple table, they were all involved in the big incident that year, and even the masterminds. However, there was still Shi Qinghai, who was currently still locked up in prison. The president will invite the leader of Nanshui to S1 for formal negotiations. If Green Dragon Mountain is really willing to join the government, this will definitely be the most explosive good news in recent years. Of course, the difficulty is also very high. If it wasn't for the fact that the threat from the Empire is too great, it would be very difficult for the government and the parliament to come to a consensus. However, the problem is that we don't know how Green Dragon Mountain is prepared to respond. This is a rare piece of good news. Su Lu put down his chopsticks and was silent for a moment before nodding seriously. If the negotiations are successful, and the anti-government forces are really willing to be incorporated, they will probably transfer a unit to the West Woods to express their attitude. Of course, this is mainly because of the greater symbolic significance. President Pabre is very sincere. The main forces of the 2nd Military Region have already been withdrawn, and the unit I belong to will be transferred to the West Woods to fight in rotation. Tai Yuan said calmly, I'll be leaving tomorrow. Take care. Su Le said softly, perhaps the next time we meet again, we'll both be on the front lines of the West Woods. A trace of worry appeared between Tai Yuan's brows. I'm staying for a few more days mainly because of you. In reality, the situation in the West Woods isn't stable. The 4th Military Region has refused the Joint Chiefs of Staff's order to increase the offensive. That Commander Zhong has guarded the Federation border for so many years and knows the Empire's people much better than we do. The problem is that the Federation needs a small-scale victory right now, to raise morale. My main mission in the West Woods this time is to persuade Commander Zhong. Of the 7 major families in the Federation, the Zhong family in the West Woods was the only one who held military power. Without a doubt, they had always been under pressure from both the Empire's main offensive and the Federation's suspicions. Hearing this, Su Le couldn't help but think of the little girl on the warship. He wondered how the little princess of the Zhong family looked like now. More importantly, after stabbing Bai Yulan, he still needed to fish Shi Qinghai out and confirm where that Bradley Wei had been sent by Madame Zhong. The next day, Tai Yuan disappeared again. Su Le knew that this friend of his carried the glory and pressure of the 1,000-year-old family. He didn't know if this friend of his could really become the president of the Federation in this long life and satisfy that Madame's ambition. He only knew that Tai Yuan wasn't necessarily happy. It was just that everyone had their own unique identity. This identity represented many things, and it wasn't something that could be easily shaken off. Su Le had the ability to change his identity. As long as he changed the chip on the back of his neck, he would be able to tear up the documents from the Ministry of Defense like they were pieces of paper. He would then be able to enter the Federation star system and not have to worry about anything anymore. The problem was that he couldn't change because there were still many people he cared about in this world, such as Shi Qinghai and Zhou Yu. An identity was a real life. Giving up one's identity meant giving up everything in this life. Su Le wanted to live a life of wandering in the universe. He didn't know if he would end up like his uncle if he changed his life too much. He didn't know if he would end up like his uncle and become a loner who couldn't return home. Other than going to the sanatorium to visit prostitutes and order around his useless students, he was actually a lonely mess with no one to talk to or drink with. In the following days, he nervously made a call to Madame Zhong. From her vague answer, he roughly knew Li Wei's whereabouts and confirmed that he was safe. Then, he went to the Zhou family in the West Mountain compound to visit Minister Zhou Yingxing. At the same time, he had a private discussion with Zhou Yu about many things. He basically spent the rest of his time negotiating with the relevant departments. He was now cheerful and sunny. Because he had nothing to lose, he had nothing to fear. Therefore, he was seeking Shi Qinghai's special pardon. The problem was that the Internal Affairs Department of the Ministry of Defense was not willing to intervene at all, and the president's official residence refused to pick up a call from a nobody like him. As for the relevant departments that could decide these things, it was really confusing. Today, it was this department, tomorrow it was that committee. The doors of the relevant departments were always closed to him. He didn't know about President Pabre's highly targeted speech at the Nebula Award ceremony a few days ago. He had been busy during this period of time. It wasn't until one day when he saw the article by Chief Editor Bob and reporter Wood in the Capital Special District Daily that he found out about what was happening in the Federation. The negotiations between the Federation government and Green Dragon Mountain were unanimously supported by hundreds of millions of people in the Federation. In the face of the evil invaders of the Empire, the citizens were really unwilling to see their own internal bloodshed. What was more eye-catching was that the government's Ministry of Justice had once again launched the Medellin special case. Senator Medellin was a spy of the Empire. This shameful matter to the Federation would probably be locked in the central database forever and kept a secret. However, just based on the investigation of the terrorist attack that had gathered a lot of evidence last year, it was enough to sentence the dead man in absentia. The Federation would not allow such a person to enjoy the respect of the people after his death. This move would probably anger some of the loyal Medellin youth soldiers, but the shocking news of the government starting negotiations with Green Dragon Mountain covered up too much of their emotions. At this moment, President Pobre and the government had the sincere support of the whole society. Even if there were some demonstrations, they wouldn't cause much of a stir. President Pobre's timing to restart the Medellin special case was perfect. It fully demonstrated his increasingly skilled political skills and wise political wisdom. The Federation began to smear dirty vintage ink on the dead Medellin, but no one dared to stand up and oppose the investigation like those in the previous era. In order to prevent the investigation from implicating them and smearing the ink on their faces, they were like those in the previous era. Including the fortune-tellers who had a very deep relationship with Medellin, they all maintained absolute silence. Taking advantage of this rare opportunity where the 7 major families of the Federation were collectively silent, the government's Ministry of Finance and the Tax Committee jointly attacked. On the 17th of June, Parliament Hill passed the gold fusion algorithm that had been debated for decades. The information disclosure that George Carlin had mentioned in his book all those years ago was a huge step forward. However, the financial giant of the Federation, the Iron Mathletes, suffered a heavy blow. Sulo was gratified to see the news, and then he finally received his transfer arrangements. To his surprise, the Ministry of Defense did not send him to the Armored Division on the front line of the West Woods. Instead, he was sent to a mysterious training base in a military vehicle. Chapter 323. Firstly, I've already updated today. Secondly, I drank some wine with my friends after returning home. Last night, I sat in front of the computer and read a lot of books. Suddenly, I felt a little lost. I haven't felt a chill in a long time, but last night, I suddenly felt a lot of emotions. My novels have been a little sticky in recent days. This is my problem. Probably because I don't have enough time and have too many things on my mind. That's why I want to mess around. Now that I think about it, when I used to write in the past, I could often write that I was very high. But ever since I killed Macklin, I don't think I've been high. How can I be more high? I have to write more freely. I'm writing too regularly now. The updates are also too regular. I'm too serious, but it's also too dense. I still have some miscellaneous matters to attend to in the past few days. From the 23rd onwards, I plan to write more freely. So on the surface, I'll update every day, but I'll write more. I won't set a task for myself. Otherwise, I'll feel relaxed every time I write a few thousand words. I'll be lazy. I have to write better. I have to write more. If I'm in the right mood in the future, I'll write more. Anyway, I'll definitely write more than what I'm writing now. Don't worry, everyone. The reason why I suddenly have so many bullshit thoughts and feelings is because today is my birthday. I'm 32 years old. Looking back, I can't say that I haven't accomplished anything, but I always feel that I can do better. The only thing I'm lacking is that one word, seriousness. All that I've said is to give myself some pressure. I'm a lazy person who can't live without pressure. In the future, I'll be more serious about my work and life and writing. I'll be able to endure these fewer and fewer days with everyone. Chapter 324. Sulo had always thought of himself as an illiterate person. During his youth, he was forced by Uncle Fengyu to spend most of his free time in Heshi State University's free library, apart from repairing electrical appliances on Xianglan Avenue and in the mine. He carefully studied no less than 200 books related to mechanical repair, such as microelectronics, structural design, and material science. He even forced himself to read a lot of books related to the humanities, such as Schiller's opera scripts, ancient Federation songs, and even seriously read the Federation's painting appreciation dictionaries. But these were all things that Uncle Feng had asked him to do, and with so many things crammed into his brain, apart from mechanical repair, he never had the opportunity to turn his memory into performance. When he was with Zhang Xiaomeng in the plum garden, love always happened in the cafeteria and on the field, so he didn't find the time to memorize those love poems that had been passed down through the ages. After that, his life was even more difficult and dangerous, so naturally, he didn't have the time to go to the capital's Metropolitan Art Gallery and express his views on art. Li Qishao's apartment had many famous paintings, but at that time, his eyes had already been burned by those flowers, so there was no reason for him to start praising the strange impressionist style of painting. The most important thing was that he didn't have a proper education. The Federation's free educational benefits for orphans had long been thrown aside by him. And he didn't have the opportunity to take the Ministry of Defense's mechanical repair exam, which he had been looking forward to, so to this day, he still didn't have a single diploma. People without a diploma were illiterate. This was the opinion of most people in the Federation, including Su Lu himself. So he had been greedily absorbing the nutrients of knowledge around him. In these 2 years, at Yue University, at the Research Institute, at the Whitewater Company, and at the Engineering Department, he constantly learned from those professors, Tai Ziyuan, and Bai Yulan, and very honestly put himself in the position of a good student. A guy without a diploma had now become an instructor of the Ministry of Defense. This kind of change made him unable to react for a while, and it was very difficult for him to adapt. The officers who were sitting upright in the training base also found it hard to get used to the fact that their instructor was actually a guy who looked younger than them and was so ordinary that they couldn't look at him. The base was not a military academy, and these officers were not ordinary military academy students. They were the best of the best selected from the Federation's anti-terrorism exercise. Although they still maintained strict discipline in class and sat abnormally straight, there was a sense of alienation and coldness in their eyes and eyebrows. In the end, it converged into a look of disdain as they looked at the podium. A young technical officer from the General Assembly base was actually sent here to explain to these battle-hardened soldiers the controls of the Federation's newest MX mecha. Due to the prominent role of mecha in the planetary landing field army and the glorious deeds of the old military god, regardless of whether it was the 3 major military academies or the West Woods Military Academy, the mecha faculty had always had the highest status. Logistical support and the strength of their teachers were all placed first. The officers in training were forced to watch that video and study the anti-terrorism assault array for 2 months before they finally received notice that they were about to begin learning how to operate the Federation's newest MX mecha. This was extremely good news, because they all knew very well what the revolutionary MX mecha meant to future battles. Last month, the General Assembly base had just begun listing the MX into the production sequence. They would definitely be the first batch of MX pilots in the military. This kind of glory and pressure filled them with anticipation and excitement for today's class. They had originally thought that the one coming to class today would definitely be a professor from the First Military Academy's mecha faculty, or perhaps the most terrifying ace pilot of the federal military. Who would have thought that such a young man would come instead? The difference between expectations and reality made the officers feel somewhat frustrated. Naturally, conflicting emotions rose in their hearts. The Ministry of Defense had not prepared a lesson plan, only giving Su Lu a question. However, when he received this question, Su Li's emotions calmed down a lot. Although he knew that he was definitely not an outstanding instructor, when it came to the MX mecha, there was probably no one in the entire Federation who was more familiar with it than he was. Thinking of this, he vaguely understood how the Federation was planning to use him. Making the best use of time to train a batch of capable MX pilots for the military was indeed the most important thing right now. He noticed the strange looks from the officers below the podium, but he did not care. Due to the discipline of the class, none of these officers dared to make a fuss or cause trouble in class. The key was that there might be some small problems during the discussion later. He hoped that Zhou Yu would be able to help out later. He looked at Zhou Yu's smiling face at the front of the class and could not help but smile. Then, he wiped the smile from his face. He slid the touch ball under his thumb to bring up the diagram of the mecha's shoulder on the screen. Then, he said seriously, when performing the power mutation, all of you must pay attention to how the threshold value of the shoulder rises. The MX's monitoring system is located at the head, just like the old system. However, due to the current instantaneous load being too large, the balance compass may be affected. Therefore, all of you must be more precise in your control and match the threshold value of the shoulder. In the underground base of the Nutshell Engineering Department, he had tested the mecha countless times. Moreover, during his exchange with Mad Manly at the Old Moon base, he had gained a deeper understanding of this new mecha. What he was saying now was undoubtedly a very rare experience. However, it was precisely because he knew this very well that his tone was very certain, almost as if he was giving a straight answer. This kind of tone was rather jarring to the ears of the officers, especially when they saw that Su Lu on the rostrum had already begun to break down the tactical movements of the MX mecha in detail, treating them as if they were his older brothers. This kind of dissatisfaction had accumulated to the extreme. After much difficulty, this lesson on the structure system was finally over. Before Su Lu could say anything, one of the officers stood up with a stern expression and said rudely to him on the rostrum, "I've made a thorough record of the tactical movements you just described. I think that everything you said is wrong. I love my teacher, but I love the truth even more." However, this officer's question was not a discussion, but more like a criticism. This was because the essentials of the mecha movement Su Lu had described seemed completely out of order to them. It was completely incompatible with the tactical movements they had learned in the 3 major military academies back then. They could not imagine how much trouble would arise operating a mecha like this, and so their impression of Su Lu subconsciously worsened. They felt that this person probably had some understanding of the MX mecha, but definitely had some great background and had pulled some strings to be able to become their instructor. Where's the mistake? Su Lu released the finger he had been using to turn off the screen to look seriously at that stern-looking officer. If the E3 turn and side slide were executed according to your instructions, it would only result in a big fall. That officer looked at Su Lu with disgust. The way I see it, you've probably never operated a mecha before. How can someone like you be qualified to teach us? Su Lu lowered his head and thought for a moment before saying, M-Series mecha. I've come into contact with them 3 times. As soon as these words were said, the entire conference room burst into an uproar. Among these most outstanding officers of the federal military present, some were not from the mecha battalions, but they had all participated in the West Woods rotational warfare for the past 10 years. They were very familiar with the mecha of the federal military, some of them had even slept in their mecha every day, yet their instructor had only operated an M-Series mecha 3 times. Su Lu ignored the uproar in the conference room. Picking up the pen in his hand, he quickly drew a rough diagram of the mecha on his terminal screen and displayed it on the screen. Pointing at the diagram on the screen and the precise numbers beside it, he said, E3 turn and side slide. If done according to my instructions, it will definitely achieve the best results. As for the fall you mentioned, I don't think it will happen. The standing officer looked at him coldly and said rudely, You want to overturn all the teaching materials of the 3 major academies. I haven't thought about that, but speaking of MX, I think you all should listen to my opinion more. After all, I am the instructor. Su Lu was an easily angered person. Although these officers were extremely rude to him, he did not feel too strongly about it. He was only thinking about the mission the Ministry of Defense had given him, and about the advance of the Imperial armies at the West Woods front lines, and his brow furrowed. He felt that these officers who were the pillars of the Federation were all so stubborn, completely unable to understand the biggest difference between the two. Thus, his words sounded rather stern. "I don't think you have the right to be our instructor." "I will report this to the higher-ups," said the officer in a deep voice. At the same time, many other officers around them stood up and cast a disdainful glance at Su Lo before preparing to leave the conference room. "I know why you all find the standard tactical movements of the MX mecha ridiculous." Su Lo was silent for a moment, and then suddenly narrowed his eyes and said, "Because you all have stupidly forgotten one thing. Compared to the MX mecha you all commonly use, the MX mecha is a completely new system. If you are satisfied with what you have in the past and want to use the things you have learned to pilot MX, it's like trying to use a bicycle to drive a car. This is truly ridiculous thinking." The leading officer's body stiffened slightly, but he still walked towards the door. However, a trace of doubt flashed across the faces of the officers behind him, and they subconsciously slowed down their steps. Su Lo no longer looked at these people. He drew a few sketches of the structure as fast as he could and marked a few extremely complicated numbers. He looked at the officers who were still sitting below the podium and said, "The order given by the Department of Defense was urgent, so I didn't start from the basics at the beginning. I thought that you should be able to understand this, but I didn't expect that you still weren't mentally prepared to control a monster. Then I will dissect this monster with you. Instantaneous quadruple power output, dual control system, cockpit design with fluid replacement, large reduction in long-range firepower, all designed for close combat. This is the MX, a ridiculous monster." Su Lo pointed at the values on the holographic screen and said, "The new ADS adaptive suspension system can solve some people's previous worries, but it will require your cooperation with the manual controls. The instantaneous explosive power applied to the spherical joints by the twin engines can allow the MX to perform actions you all could never have imagined in the past. Let's take a look at the CLK value and CLS value. I don't have the specific parameters from the previous experiment, but in the test run, it has already been confirmed. The stability under overclocking state. Here is a wave value chart you can analyze." Half an hour passed in the midst of Su Li's slightly dry explanation. Hearing the most detailed breakdown of the MX mecha, the officers in the meeting room recorded it seriously. Those officers who had stood up stopped in their tracks somewhat awkwardly. Right then, they finally found that although they did not know how practical the instructor on the podium was, his knowledge of the MX mecha did seem to be very thorough. Those parameters and related tactical actions he had mentioned seemed to really be able to work together. This is a brand new mecha, so it needs a brand new pilot. This is the real reason why I am here as an instructor." Su Lo narrowed his eyes, swept his gaze over the officers in the meeting room, and said, "The teaching materials of the 3 major military academies. I suddenly understand that the mission the Ministry of Defense gave me was probably to overturn these teaching materials." The meeting room was silent, and only his voice could be heard. "Just now, I said that I have only come into contact with the M-Series mecha 3 times. Many of you must have some disdain for me, thinking that I am very untrustworthy as an instructor." He paused for a moment, and then said, "But perhaps you all don't know this, but in terms of time spent in contact with the MX mecha, I am definitely the one who has spent the most time in this federation. After spending half a year in the underground of the Nutshell Engineering Department, in terms of understanding of the new MX mecha, in the entire federation, Su Lo and Shang Qiu were probably the 2 people with the most comprehensive understanding. This was because other than the research and development of certain key parts, the entire mecha's assembly system had also been completed by them. As for first-hand understanding of the mecha in actual combat, even Shang Qiu could not be mentioned in the same breath as Su Lo. There were no real idiots in the Ministry of Defense, and that old man from the Lees of Philadelphia was no idiot either. They wanted to maximize Su Li's value to the maximum, so this temporary arrangement before them was unquestionably the best choice. Su Li had no room to refuse. He was also very willing to contribute to increasing the federal military's combat strength in the face of the Empire's invasion. Thus, although he had never been an instructor before, today, he would try to suppress the arrogance of these officers. Walking down from the podium, he smiled at Zhou Yu and said a few words. Then, holding the electronic document in his hand, he left the conference room, not even looking at those officers. Zhou Yu, you know this arrogant fellow? The officers looked at Zhou Yu and asked, is this fellow a technical supervisor on loan from the Nutshell Engineering Department? The long first lesson had allowed these officers to truly understand Su Li's thorough understanding of the MX mecha. Furthermore, they knew that Zhou Yu had once carried out the full materials plan at the Nutshell Engineering Department, so they naturally associated him with the Nutshell company that had developed the MX. He should not be at the Nutshell Engineering Department now. Zhou Yu was silent for a moment. He thought to himself that Ka Qifeng's battle was still in a semi-secret state, but the development of the MX mecha no longer needed to be kept a secret. After some thought, he stood up and smiled at the officers in the conference room. His name is Su Lu, the main developer of the MX mecha. The main developer of the MX mecha. What did this title mean? These outstanding officers who had studied in the various military academies naturally knew. Connecting the dots to this person's age, in addition to their shock, their slightly furrowed brows gradually relaxed into disbelief. The other developer is not that much older than him, and she's also a lady. Zhou Yu smiled and said, to have the developer personally explain the MX, I think this is a rare opportunity. Even if he really is the developer of the MX mecha, he is not a soldier after all. How can he teach the true tactical movements and controls of the battlefield? The stern-faced officer walked back from the door and said with a cold smile, it's just an armchair strategist. The training base was hidden in the dense mountains. Up until now, Su Li still had not figured out the exact location. After all, he was not a professional soldier. On the way here on his private jet, he could not pinpoint the exact location just by looking at the sun's position and the direction of the mountain range. After finishing his first class, he walked to the viewing platform of the training field of the base. Putting down the electronic document in his hands, he sat down and sank into silence. The president had signed a special pardon, and he had signed the 2 thin indentures from the Ministry of National Defense. Then, he had been sent to this remote base. He lit a cigarette and narrowed his eyes at the wild grass growing wildly on the training field. For some reason, he actually thought of the scenery outside the window of Qingqing's military prison. If he had been the one to teach those military prisoners about the MX mecha, perhaps it would have been easier to teach than these officers today, right? He thought this somewhat ludicrously. Su Li's personality was one that valued promises above all else. Since he had signed the indenture, he would do this well. Thus, going against his conscience, he played the role of indifference in the meeting room, simulating things like prestige. However, he knew that just based on his understanding of the MX mecha, it was not enough to make those officers truly lower their heads. Instructors and students were natural enemies. The greater the pressure, the greater the resistance. It was just that this instructor, Su Li, was a little too young, and those students were a little too fierce. These soldiers all had academy backgrounds and were already basic-level commanders in their respective units. Just sitting upright in the meeting room gave off the feeling of a powerful army. These past few years, they had killed countless enemies in the West Woods. There was even a sense of pride and ruthlessness that was deeply rooted in their bones. Moreover, it was their profession. Thinking of the word profession, Su Li could not help but lick his lips and curse under his breath. Profession often meant inflexibility, meant bureaucracy. The bureaucracy of the government and the military could tell from this incident. The new mecha had clearly been successfully developed last year, but in the end, from assembly to training, it had actually dragged on for a full half a year. After he had been released from prison, he had thought that the Federation had already trained countless skilled MX pilots. In the end, he had not expected that he would still have to do this himself. After fiercely smoking a cigarette, Su-Lu stood up and walked towards the dormitory. He thought to himself, I've killed as many people as you all. If we want to compete, I can only pretend for you all to see. Chapter 325. The fresh blood of the military who had been specially groomed by the Federation might have had the word fresh in them, but they were definitely not true rookies. These officers who had been trained were at least the fellows of a Special Forces company commander in their own base, and were also admired by the leaders of their respective units, doted on like treasures. Thus, although they could not be said to be truly arrogant and willful, there was definitely an aloof attitude in their eyes that treated everyone else as if they were nothing. In terms of overall strength, these officers were unquestionably among the best in the federal military. Otherwise, their units would not have chosen them to participate in the joint exercise. Losing so badly in front of their brother units, other than losing face, there was no other benefit. A certain person's mecha control was ferocious, able to break through the 4th level of the test with an M37. A certain person's face was not red nor was he out of breath after injuring a target with a combination of firearms, and he could even pretend to be a scarecrow in a grain field. A certain person hid in a swamp during the exercise and did not show his face for 7 days. In the end, it was only when the staff of the 1st Military Region, the organizer of the exercise, had almost checked the data of the Bureau of Proclamation that he floated out like a ghost to tail behind the pursuit team, silently performing a great comeback. Each of them had their own strengths that could not be replicated, so it was very difficult to determine a true victor. Moreover, they were all characters who had once fought in turn in the West Woods. Perhaps they had even supported each other on the battlefield back then, so the officer cadets themselves were able to respect each other and live in harmony. However, after the anti-terrorism exercise ended, these prodigious soldiers were locked up in the training base for several months of training. Before the new year, the federal military had suddenly raised the security level. Coupled with the rare anti-terrorism joint exercise, although they had not received any clear orders, they knew that the situation between the Federation and the Empire was definitely becoming tense again. However, at such a critical time, they were unable to return to their own units and fight alongside their comrades. Instead, they were locked up in this godforsaken base in silence. How could they not be frustrated? It had to be said that the reason Su-Lu had attracted so many conflicting emotions during the first lesson of the new MX mecha had a lot to do with the emotions of the officers about to erupt. The trainees received comprehensive training at the base, and the Federation attached great importance to it. It was obvious that they were preparing for this batch of officers to grow into generals who could command an area on the battlefield. Thus, they had set up many courses, among which were courses on command and tactical deduction. Among the 19 courses, the course on the new mecha, which had started less than 2 days ago, was particularly unremarkable. However, this was the class that the officers didn't want to attend the most right now, because they realized that the young instructor that they had once disregarded and looked down upon was really a good-for-nothing. The holographic screen in the conference room flashed with structural blueprints and core data that were constantly changing. Su-Lu stood on the podium, coldly looking at the officers below the podium, and said in a calm tone, he said calmly, the base covers an area of 47 square kilometers, and that doesn't include the wilderness mountain area behind it. The Federation has set up such a large area and invited the best teachers from the 3 major military academies just to train the 30 or so of you. In the end, you've spent 4 days and still haven't grasped the most basic tactical movements. I really don't know what's going on in your brains. The citizens of the Federation pay taxes to support you bunch of soldiers. don't you feel ashamed? With your level, any random person from the Empire's Royal Special Forces would be able to kill you. I'm not asking you to grasp the design of the twin-engine jet. The electron turbulence generator involves quantum physics. I believe that you won't be able to learn it even if you study for another 3 years. But you haven't even grasped the basic structural blueprints for the wings. How are you going to go to the battlefield in the future? Back to the standard tactical movements. I've already told you very clearly that this is a brand new set of movements. Forget all those useless techniques and rules from the past, and don't even remember the sacred rule of not leaving the ground with your mechanical legs. Then come and challenge my experience. I can jump up and kick someone when I'm operating the prototype MX. In the underground storeroom, you're operating a MX, and you still want to learn how to move slowly like a little girl. Sula spoke very slowly, his tone very calm, but every word he spoke was filled with the stupidity and rigidity of the officer students. That kind of tone was enough to infuriate anyone. The faces of the proud officers below the stage were livid. They stared fixedly at the tactical light screen in front of them, but they forcefully suppressed their anger and did not stand up to fight it out with him. These officers who thought that they understood mecha very well, after several days of arguments in class, had already deeply realized that the little instructor on the rostrum was indeed a mecha expert. No matter how inconceivable the standard tactical movements he proposed were, in practice after class, he could always prove that he was correct. This was especially so during class debates. Each time an officer below raised an objection, Instructor Sulu would be able to report precise data even with his eyes closed, sharply and coldly mocking the crowd. And in practice after class, the officers could not help but angrily find that everything he said was right. If one did not understand the MX mecha as well as one's own body, how could one possibly be able to deduce the fluctuations in the parameters of the mecha's movements just from the data in one's mind? Practice was the only standard to test the truth. In the military camp, only the strong were the standard. In terms of MX mecha operation theory, the officers were shocked to find that no matter how hard they tried, they could not seem to compare to the instructor on the rostrum. Thus, these past few days, when the instructor had been harshly mocking and even scolding them, they could only forcefully suppress their anger, patiently waiting for a chance to take revenge in the future. You can still jump up and kick someone when you're operating the prototype MX, but you can only move your mecha slowly like a little girl. This sentence was too harsh, too cruel. The stifling silence in the classroom was mixed with the sound of angry breathing. Seated at the front, Zhou Yu's expression could not help but turn ugly. He lowered his head and laughed bitterly in his heart. Because he was that person who had been kicked by Su Lu with the prototype MX, someone. That had been 2 years ago at Pear Blossom University. At that time, Zhou Yu had already felt that Su Lu was a genius at mecha operation, but he could never have imagined that in such a short time, Su Lu would already become a level 1 mecha instructor of the Ministry of Defense, and Zhou Yu himself would become his student. I know you all are very capable people, because I am different from you. I believe in the vision of the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense chose me to teach you all naturally because I have the qualifications to do so. Since the Ministry of Defense chose you all, then you all are naturally also excellent soldiers, and have the right to be proud. This seemed to be what an instructor should be doing, first hammering the students a little, then slightly restoring the others' confidence. The atmosphere in the classroom relaxed slightly, but unexpectedly, Su Lu continued coldly, but, in mecha class, in front of me, you all have no right to be proud. If you want to deal with me, you all need to pass the mecha operation test first, and then try to challenge me. I don't have the time or the time of the Empire to play these childish games with you all. The federal officers, who had been humiliated by Instructor Su's words these days, had long been thinking about how to find a suitable opportunity to compare notes with Instructor Su on the podium, who seemed to only know how to talk on paper. However, they did not expect that instructor Su seemed to have guessed this point and decisively erased this possibility. He even reprimanded their idea of a challenge as childish. Hearing these words, Shou Yu, who was sitting in the front row, finally could not help but raise his head to glance at Su Lu on the rostrum. Deep confusion appeared on his usually gentle face. He thought to himself, with your mecha combat ability, it's more than enough to take care of a few of the fiercest ace mecha pilots in the class. One battle would be enough to determine the instructor's dignity, so why not do that? What made Shou Yu even more confused was this instructor Su on the rostrum really the Su Lu he knew? This cold instructor who wore sunglasses in the classroom, whose lips were as sharp as a knife, and whose face was as cold as the snow in Linhai University, was he really that mechanic who always had a smile on his face and a face full of sunshine? Finally, an officer could not control his emotions under Su Li's incisive insults. He stood up abruptly and angrily protested, even if the tactical standard movements you designed are the only correct ones, we are indeed trying to familiarize ourselves with them. But why is there a mecha mechanic aspect in your assessment criteria? A brand new suspension system, and a fitting program for the spherical joint, that's a whole 3 big books. How can we learn in such a short time? Don't forget that we are frontline officers, not mecha soldiers. He looked angrily at Su Lu and said, you've been unwilling to go on the mecha all this time. Is it because you're afraid of being exposed? You're a captain, I'm a lieutenant colonel. You're a student, I'm an instructor. I didn't ask you to stand up, but you stood up. Su Lu stood on the rostrum and looked at him coldly. Count yourself how many rules you've broken. Go run 3 laps on the field yourself. I'll answer your questions to the other students. If the answer is already over by the time you run back, you can ask someone else. After saying this, he adjusted the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose. From the start of the second class, Su Lu began to wear the brand new lieutenant colonel uniform to class. He wore sunglasses and had the purple star medal pinned to his chest. The military rank and medal were the rewards he had received for developing the MX mecha. That day, he had thrown them into a pile of snow after leaving the Lufeng Slope clubhouse. Now, the Ministry of Defense had arranged a new one for him. Originally, Madman Li was the only lieutenant colonel at such a young age in the Federation. Now, Su Lu was added. Even Tai Yuan, who had achieved great merit in the S2 secret mission and gotten first place in the anti-terrorist exercise, who had the support of a 1,000-year-old family, was still only a major. When Su Lu walked into the classroom wearing the lieutenant colonel uniform, the officers below suddenly became silent. They were of different ages, but even those who were over 30 years old were only majors at most. However, this young instructor was actually a lieutenant colonel. Su Lu wanted to complete the mission of the Ministry of Defense in the shortest amount of time possible, so he didn't have the leisure to mingle with the officers. He simply came here with his horse, using his identity as an instructor to suppress the students, using his identity as a senior officer to suppress the officers, and using the honor of the Purple Star Medal to suppress the other party's honor. If it were up to him, he would have hung the Purple Star Medal on his chest. Unfortunately, that incomparably precious medal was obtained from assassinating Macklin. In the foreseeable future, it would have to be hidden in a dusty box. Even so, the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation, the holder of the Purple Star Medal, and a first-class instructor in the Ministry of Defense. These 3 identities were like 3 mountains weighing down on the hearts of the officers below the podium, causing them to be vigilant, shocked, and silent. In their silence, they still thought that this young instructor who wore sunglasses in class during the day was probably an arrogant guy who only knew how to show off. They were waiting for the day when he would show off and ignite the anger of the entire base. However, later on, reality proved them wrong. This young instructor's background was even greater than they had imagined. in the midst of the chaos caused by Instructor Sue, the senior officers in charge of the discipline of the base actually completely followed his lead. They had even specially sent several military police officers to maintain order during the mecha class according to his request. Hearing this, the officer was stunned. Looking at the instructor's lieutenant colonel uniform and the purple star medal, he knew that he had been blinded by anger and let the instructor have something against him. He then looked at the military police officers who were eyeing him with hostility at the door of the meeting room. He couldn't help but grumble bitterly, took off his military cap, and walked out. Why do you want to learn mechanical structure and maintenance? This is another very stupid question. After the officer who had violated discipline left to run, Sulu adjusted the sunglasses on his nose and said coldly, "This only proves once again your inflexibility and stupidity." Mechanical repair camp. On the battlefield, if the entire mechanical repair camp is wiped out, and you guys are left empty-handed with the spare parts in the supply depot but can't even deal with the mecha's self-damage, what will you do then? There's another very important point. The MX mecha's main use on the battlefield, aside from direct attacks, is for long-distance special operations. Back then, Marshal Lee ambushed the Empire's emperor from thousands of miles away and killed the enemy chief in one fell swoop. Does he still have mechanical engineers by his side? Ridiculous. An officer raised his hand silently. Sulu squinted at this person through his sunglasses and found that it was the person who had walked out first during the first class. Suppressing the curve of his lips that was about to curve up, Sulu said coldly, "Ask." This officer's surname was Hua, and his name was Xiaoxi. He belonged to the 4th Military Region's Special Mecha Team. These past few years, he had operated the M52 mecha on the front lines of the West Woods. Who knew how many battles he had fought with the Empire's people? His control of military mecha was exceptionally strong. In his mind, the only person in the entire Federation who was worthy of his admiration in terms of mecha control was the god of war Li Pifu, Commander Zhou, and the retired Commander Tian. Even the current commander was not worthy of his respect. As for these outstanding officers in the base, he only thought that Zhou Yu, who had come from the 1st Military Academy's mecha department, had the ability to compete with him in terms of mecha combat. It was precisely this strong self-confidence that made him extremely dissatisfied with those tactical movements Su Lo had proposed during the first class, and he had taken the initiative to raise his doubts. However, after so many days of class, Hua Xiaoxi understood that the instructor Su on the podium was truly talented. Although he did not know what his actual control level was, his theoretical level was definitely second to none. A trace of respect gradually grew in his heart, but this trace of respect was instantly wiped clean by Su Li's cold reprimand and humiliation. He stood up and saluted Su Lo on the podium. There was no fault in any of his movements, and he said in a low voice, reporting to instructor, "The Federation only has one god of war. You cannot expect every pilot to have that kind of ability, so I think that you can learn about mecha, but not too much." Sulu looked at him, and after a moment of silence, suddenly said, "Have you seen the movie where Marshal Lee assassinated the Emperor of the Empire?" Yes. In fact, everyone in the conference room had seen it, but they did not understand why Sulu would ask this. Sulu continued expressionlessly, "The movie is all fake. If you have paid attention to the war situation report sent by the Department of Defense back then, you should know that back then, on that resource planet within the Empire, Marshal Lee ran for thousands of miles. Along the way, his mecha's assembly system nearly broke down 3 times. Marshal Lee used local materials for all of them, obtaining parts and components from his own mecha on the battlefield. He even modified the mecha that the Empire left behind in the mountains. That was how he managed to support the M37 to the end. If Marshal Lee was as clueless about mecha mechanics as you all are, how could he have accomplished such a shocking feat? In fact, this is what I admire the most about Marshal Lee. To be able to drive a broken, and kill the Emperor of the Empire. He praised loudly, "This is really not something a human can do. So, to become a real pilot, first of all, you must learn how to be a mecha mechanic." Sulu looked at the officers below the podium and said coldly, "The Federation's military regulations have never had such a rule. This is my opinion. Because MX is different, I think that since the Department of Defense asked me to train you all, they must agree with my opinion on MX. But, we are not the war god after all." Hua Xiaoxi shook his head with a serious expression. A soldier who does not want to become a marshal is not a good soldier. After saying this, Sulu looked at the thoughtful expressions of Hua Xiaoxi and the officers below the podium, and suddenly fell into silence. Training pilots for the Department of Defense, pretending to be cold, but as time passed, he found that he had actually sunk into this kind of role-playing. These young officers below the podium, full of vigor and strength, would soon step onto the battlefield to welcome the great battle with the Empire, and these officers who were destined to become the elites of the military were his own students. Thinking of this, a faint sense of pride grew in his heart. After pausing for a moment, he said seriously, "Not to mention that you are not soldiers, but officers. Don't forget that when Marshal Li went to kill the Emperor of the Empire, he was only the commander of the 17th Armored Division. He was just a soldier like you, but he dared to do so, so he is no longer a human, but a war god. During the first assessment, I hope that some of you can pass. Maybe after the training, it will be difficult for us to meet again, or maybe you don't want to remember my name at all, but I still want to say that my name is Sulu. I am Instructor Su, in the ancient language, that is Teacher Hugh. Of course, with your knowledge reserve, you definitely don't know much about the ancient language." After mocking as usual, Sulu adjusted the sunglasses on his nose again and left the conference room. On the shore of Lake Feiqing, under the reflection of the snowy mountains, a general stood behind an old man in casual clothes, pulled up the video on the holographic screen, and said with a smile, "Father, he said you are not human." The war god of the Federation, Li Pifu, smiled. The age spots on his forehead were particularly obvious, and his old voice sounded, "To be able to disregard life and death and throw away the instincts of living creatures, at that moment, you really can't be called a human. This little guy has had many inhuman experiences, so it is a good choice for Zhou Yingxing to make him an instructor. But I still have expectations for this little guy. After the training, let him go back to Whitewater. He is too young." For some reason, Major General Li looked at the screen and smiled bitterly. He felt a little disappointed and said something that seemed to have nothing to do with what he was saying. Li Pifuk sat quietly by the lake, looking at the reflection of the snowy mountains in the distance, and said with a smile, "Don't worry too much, just let nature take its course. If I remember correctly, they know each other, and have met each other more than once." Major General Li had never learned to disobey his father in his life. The old man on the shore of Lake Feiqing was his father, but his more important identity was the war god who protected the Federation. Although he couldn't understand why his father paid so much attention to the young man, and even made some decisions that he felt were inconceivable, he believed that his father must have seen the future many years in the future. The foggy future was something that he couldn't see through, and was unwilling to touch. Those sunglasses don't seem to be his. They are a bit loose, and he wants to pretend to be cold, but he looks a bit funny. I don't understand what he wants to do. The atmosphere by the lake was a bit silent and weird. Major General Li forced a smile and mentioned some details in the training base. The old man gently let go of his hand, stood up, and stood on the rock, his eyes full of wisdom and iron will forged on the battlefield. He said slowly, "The young man is eager to teach all he knows to the military, to prove that Mr. President's pardon order is correct." Major General Li didn't understand what he meant. The old man said with a smile, "The more important he is to the Federation, the more likely that the spy in the prison will be pardoned. I pay attention to Sulu, not only because of his relationship with your uncle, not only because of his ability, but also because of his temperament. The old man fell silent again after hearing this. He thought to himself, if he didn't have the opposite ancient style of caring and righteousness, I wouldn't dare to take such a big risk and use him. Not many people in the Federation knew about the obscure and complicated relationship between Sue Lo and the Lees of Philadelphia. Even President Pobre and General Miles didn't think of a certain interstellar prodigal uncle, a fugitive from the Federation. Probably only the lady in the back of the mountain knew the whole truth. The senior generals of the federal military only knew that the war god appreciated this young man, so when Zhou Yingxing issued a written order to transfer Su Le to the training base, no one dared to raise an objection. With such a background, Su Le's treatment in the training base naturally wouldn't be bad. He pushed open the door of the instructor's apartment and walked in. He washed his face with hot water, looked at the blurry face in the mirror, and couldn't help but sigh, rubbing his cheeks hard. He had to play the cold instructor every day, and he almost couldn't even smile anymore. He looked at the face in the mirror with some bitterness, then looked at the sunglasses on the stage. He had borrowed this pair from another instructor, and it was a bit big, so it wasn't very suitable to wear. He knew that the officers in the training base were actually very good, but they hadn't come into contact with the new mecha. There would definitely be people who could pass the next test, but he didn't know what kind of challenge he would face. I don't have any intention of fighting in the arena. He looked at himself, gently clenched his fist, smiled, then picked up the phone and pressed a string of numbers. Chapter 326. Su Le had never planned to use actual combat to establish his authority as an instructor, because he did not have the simulation system with him right now. Before heading to S2 to assassinate Macklin, he had taken out the simulation system from under the workbench and placed it in the safe at Whitewater Company. Now, that expensive workbench had become the evidence of the Federation government, and he did not know whether he still had the authority to enter Whitewater Company, so he could only leave the simulation system there. The call was to Li Xiaotong. After being released from prison, Su Le had not gone to see him, even though he was the first person in the Federation willing to invest in him. Su Le knew from Zhou Yu that the Li family was not in a good situation right now. Because the government and the parliament had continuously passed the gold fusion algorithm, the Li family's influence in the financial industry of the Federation had taken a heavy blow. These measures would not shake the foundation of the Iron family, but as the second in line to the family, Li Xiaotong must be busy right now. From a certain perspective, Su Le should be the Li family's irreconcilable enemy, but he had always maintained some kind of tacit relationship with 7th young Master Li. Now that Su Le had gained the favor of the Lees of Philadelphia, just this point alone could convince Li Xiaotong to invest a second time and maintain this almost friendly relationship, and the upper echelons of the Li family could only acquiesce. Su Le needed 7th young Master Li's help to reassemble the simulation system. In fact, even without the help of the simulation system, he believed that he could still defeat this batch of officer students in the base by operating the MX mecha. However, Zhou Yu had seen the Battle of Kachim Peak with his own eyes. If the difference in skill level was too great, it might arouse his suspicion. After all, this gentle gentleman had too close a relationship with Macho at the back of the mountain, so Su Le had to be careful. More importantly, if he could not display Madman Li's level of battle prowess in battle and obtain an overwhelming victory, then even if he won this battle, what was the point? She had signed a contract to sell her body and was transferred by the Department of Defense to serve a group of military officers. This was not happiness at all. However, everyone had a different view of happiness. Su Le rubbed his cheeks and looked at himself in the mirror with a smile. He began to carefully shave his beard. He thought of the difficult days in the black prison and how he no longer had to worry about his identity as a fugitive. Every time he washed his face, he no longer had to trim his eyebrows. He felt endless happiness. The training base in the mountains went from early summer to late summer, and then the autumn wind gradually rose, but it couldn't blow away the summer heat. The days passed by in such a boring manner. Although the officers from the various units were still angry, they were exceptionally serious in their learning and training. In the underground mecha storeroom, the 3MX standard mecha were actually trained night after night, lined up by the officers to train them. Although they were not frail bodies, it was still extremely tiring. Sulu really hadn't expected that his simple provocation of disdain would actually have some effect. These officers were clearly all academically trained soldiers who had graduated from military academies. Their IQ and EQ couldn't be low, so how was it that things were going according to his plan? After thinking about it, he could only attribute this to the atmosphere of the military camp. Although there was also deception in the military, it was still a distance away from society after all. It retained a rare sense of simplicity. These officers had been in the military for a long time, so the simple and direct part of their bodies had manifested. Perhaps some of them roughly understood Instructor Su's intentions, but no one would give him a good attitude. They just kept their heads down and trained, waiting for the beautiful day to come when they passed the assessment and beat the instructor up. Simple and direct was very much in line with Su Li's personality, so these days, he kept his usual sullen face, playing the role of a cold and disdainful instructor. He wasn't worried about the arrival of that day. Instead, through the new sunglasses that Zuyu had sent him, he looked with interest at these officers who were howling as if they had taken aphrodisiac and had nowhere to vent their energy. He thought to himself, so the military is actually such a simple place. There was no ready-made tutorial for the MX training, so Sulu had to compile everything on the spot. Moreover, the MX in the nutshell production department and the assembly line of the main assembly base had undergone many minor adjustments compared to the prototype designed by Su Lu and Shang Qiu. He also didn't have any teaching experience, so every day, teaching classes was actually a very painful process. Fortunately, he had obtained a lot of information from the nutshell production company through the Ministry of Defense, and had also applied for permission to work remotely with Shang Qiu. In addition, he had the experience of training in Area H1 of Yue University's library, so he was able to do this job with great difficulty. Sometimes, Sulu would feel a little smug. The federal military probably really needed this teaching material. If he could do this job well, wouldn't Mr. Shi's special pardon order be issued? Other than tormenting himself with the MX mecha training, Sulu was also silently paying attention to the situation in the West Woods and the movements within the Federation. The Federation's proverb had once said, even after leaving the palace of His Majesty and being amongst the stars, one still could not forget the troubles of the world. Sulu knew what kind of intelligence this imperial spy had sent back, but he didn't know when the next war would break out. The Federation government was anxiously waiting, and so was he. But first came the good news that the leader of the Green Dragon Mountain anti-government army, Nan Shui, was visiting the capital. In these peaceful days, the first gust of autumn wind at the beginning of September brought another batch of students to the training base. Sulu, who had been ordered by the base's commanding officer to receive them, saw the dozen or so men jumping out of military vehicles at the entrance of the base. His eyes narrowed involuntarily. Autumn had not yet arrived, but he could already feel the chill. There were a total of 17 men, some of them tall and sturdy, some of them lean and strong, some of them cold and ruthless. They were not wearing military uniforms, but they exuded a murderous aura from head to toe. However, some of them could hide this murderous aura with just a slight turn of their bodies, leaving not a trace of it exposed. Xiong Linquan, Lu Jiao, Gu Shifeng, and Major Lan Xiaolong. Sulu looked at the row of people standing at attention in front of him, and understood why the base's commanding officer had sent him, a temporary instructor, to receive them. It was because, of these 17 men, other than Lan Xiaolong, the rest were all members of the 7th Combat Team of the Whitewater Company. The 7th Combat Team of the Security Advisory Department of the Whitewater Company under the jurisdiction of the Nutshell Company has been reorganized. We have been ordered to report to the commanding officer. Please give us further instructions. The fierce combatants stood side by side meticulously. Gunner Xiong Lin Quan took a step forward and shouted at Su Lo, his voice shaking the mountains. Su Lo was speechless. He did not know if this person was shouting at him because he had stabbed Bai Yulan, or if it was because of his habitual loud voice. Fortunately, he had been a cold and ruthless instructor at the training base for more than 2 months. He had more or less cultivated the cold and fierce aura of a soldier, so he could calmly look at the big face in front of him and did not take a step back. After a moment of silence, he did not understand and said softly, "There are no instructions. Since you're here, let's eat first." Sitting behind the self-propelled green rail car that entered the base, Su Lo took off his sunglasses, narrowed his eyes, and asked with a frown, "What's going on?" The 7th Combat Team was reorganized. Why was it sent to the base? It was a direct order from the Ministry of National Defense. The 7th Combat Team has been reorganized for a long time, but you, the director, have not been here, so they have been idle. The 83-84 Combat Team also picked a group of people to be the peripheral force of the 7th Combat Team. This time, they did not come with you. Now that I think about it, the people you can command are basically a battalion. Major Lon Xiaolong sat beside him. As an officer of the Harbor City Guard District, he had spent some time with Su Lo, so he was comfortable talking to him. He shrugged and said, "In Harbor City, the order I received was to protect you, and now it seems to be the same." Su Lo was silent for a long time. Looking at the silent members in front of the rail car, he pursed his lips and said, "I'm asking why." "It was an order from the Ministry of National Defense. How do we know the reason?" Lon Xiaolong shrugged again and said, "But I can guess a little." Su Lo looked at him with a bitter smile and said, "Hurry up and say it, or the question marks in my head are going to explode. I'm from the 17th Armored Division." White Magnolia. Lon Xiaolong looked at his face and said, "You're also from the 17th Division. Out of the 18 members of the 7th Combat Team, 15 of them are from our division. The 7th Combat Team has always been the strongest in the Whitewater Company. The Ministry of National Defense bypassed the Nutshell Board of Directors and directly ordered the reorganization of the 7th Combat Team. The 83-84 Combat Team was stationed in the Harbor City Guard District. Before the unit's designation was changed, it was the most famous 17th Armored Division of the Federation. Li Pifu was the commander of the 17th Armored Division. Su Lo was silent. How could a combat team of the security company be related to the old man in Philadelphia? You're training officers in the training base, which is contributing to the Federal Army. You're leading the 7th Combat Team to give you a group of your own subordinates. Lon Xiaolong took a puff of his cigarette, and his expression became serious and serious. The old commander definitely doesn't want to see his old unit turn from an iron-blooded army into a group of riffraff troops. Since he thinks highly of you, this mission naturally has to be given to you. You definitely can't be a commander now, so you can only start practicing with the 7th Combat Team. Su Lo felt that this reasoning was too ridiculous. Li Pifu was the Federation's god of war. Even if he took care of him a little for the sake of his uncle, how could he let him do this kind of thing? You guessed right. Nonsense, if I could know what those big shots are thinking, why would I be a soldier? Wouldn't it be better to just charge into the stock market? Lon Xiaolong said in annoyance. The team members in front of the railcar had been sitting for a while, but now they began to relax. Some of them crossed their legs, some of them began to smoke, and some of them began to talk loudly. Su Luk shook his head and thought about how this major peeked at Shang Qiu's cleavage in the underground base of the Ministry of Engineering. He sighed and said, "No wonder you're from the 83-84 Combat Team. Same here, you're not a proper soldier either. Lon Xiaolong shrugged and said that in addition to the 30 or so excellent military officers in the training base, there were suddenly 17 more unofficially organized armed personnel. Although according to the Ministry of Defense, these armed personnel were only there to listen, the atmosphere in the base still became a little strange. The three major security companies of the Federation often cooperated with the military in battle, but there was a gap between active duty soldiers and these unofficially organized soldiers. The armed personnel of Team 7 actually had military records in their respective units, but for some reason, when they returned to the unit, they didn't look like professional soldiers at all. They were doing their duty as unofficially organized soldiers. The most important thing was that the officers who received the training had graduated from various universities and belonged to the typical academic faction. However, the 17 men who came later were definitely born in the wilderness. They all started off as small soldiers on the battlefield and relied on killing enemies to get to where they were today. In terms of rank, the trained officers were naturally higher. Other than Lon Xiaolong, none of the members of Team 7 had the nerve to take out their epaulets to dry. In terms of commanding ability and comprehensive assessment of some subjects, the trained officers were also a lot better than the members of Team 7. But when it came to specific combat ability, those 17 men were all looking up, full of disdain and contempt for these academic military nobles. What made Su Lu feel strange was that although the atmosphere in the base was strange and tense, there was no intense conflict between the two sides. After 2 days of observation, even though his but was vaguely on Team 7's side, he had to admit that it was mainly because those academic soldiers were maintaining their tolerance and did not show the attitude of a superior officer. The attention of the trained officers was all on the upcoming mecha assessment. Most of the other subjects had already been completed, but for this MX mecha assessment, their eyes were already red from waiting. Because of the attitude Su Lu had displayed in the base, the trained officers began to dig up his background. In the end, they finally found out about his relationship with the Minister of Defense's family. Everyone thought they understood why Su Lu was so arrogant. This kind of nepotism was the most unacceptable thing in the military, and their hearts became increasingly conflicted. In the dorms at night, one could often hear some officer coldly saying that he was ready to open a paint factory to teach someone a lesson. A week after the arrival of the 17 men, the MX Mech's first assessment had ended. Most of the officers who had been trained had demonstrated excellent control and combat abilities in the assessment, reaching the passing standard. The ones with the best results were Hua Xiaoxi from Celine, and Zhou Yu, who had a deep understanding of the MX Mech. On the rostrum, Su Lu finished reading out the results and sighed softly. Very satisfied with the results of these 2 months of hard work, he removed the sunglasses on his nose and said to the people below the rostrum, "In half an hour, I'll be waiting for you all at the entrance." The conference room was silent. The trained officers stood up silently and walked towards the door. This silence seemed to hide some kind of hostility. Due to the strict military discipline, they could not do anything to the instructor. Today, they finally had a chance to vent their anger openly, but after all, they were all mid-ranking officers and would not make a big fuss like a hooligan. Instead, they all clenched their fists in excitement. Unexpectedly, half an hour later, Su Lu did not walk with them into the underground hangar, but instead led them to the field. Accompanied by the dull evening breeze, some of the fallen leaves on the field moved slowly. Wearing sunglasses, Su Lu turned his head and said to the officers, "Who is it?" "Me." Hua Xiaoxi from the West Woods Military District stepped forward and glanced calmly at Su Lu, his heart brimming with confidence. He had tied for the highest score in this assessment, and from the very beginning, he had been the one to lead his fellow students in resisting Instructor Su's humiliation. Stepping forward now to challenge on behalf of the officers was only natural. Very natural. Su Lu nodded and said, "After learning MX for so long, you are the most outstanding student. I think you should know very well what MX's main purpose is." This was the question an instructor asked a student. Hua Xiaoxi thought for a moment and then said without hesitation, "It's to kill using physical techniques. To control MX well, other than familiarizing yourself with the operating system, what is the most important tactical quality a pilot should have? Close-range combat." Su Le unbuttoned the collar of his lieutenant colonel uniform, nodded and said, "You said it very clearly. Then use close-range combat to knock me down, then use mecha. Do you have any objections?" The surrounding officers looked at each other. Although they felt that the instructor's words were slightly different from what they had said at the beginning, these words also made some sense. The key was to use mecha to challenge. With the protection of the safety control system, they could at most make instructor Su lose some face. Using close-range combat to challenge first was even better. Other than making the instructor lose face, they could also make the instructor's face bruise and vent their anger. As for whether these people would lose or not, they had not considered it. Until today, they still thought that the young instructor Su was a pretty good technical supervisor, an arrogant brat with a great background. If they really fought, how could he be a match for people like them who had been on the battlefield for so long? Without another word, Hua Xiaoxi took off his uniform and began to move the joints of his arms and legs, warming up before the fight. After taking off his clothes, it was discovered that this ace pilot from the West Woods military district had strong muscles. He was definitely also an expert in close-range combat. The surrounding officers had expressions of schadenfreude on their faces. Now that the test was over, there was naturally no need to maintain absolute courtesy to the instructor. Occasionally, a trace of doubt would flash across the faces of a few people. They felt that there was something wrong with the instructor agreeing to this challenge. However, no one noticed that at the edge of the crowd, two officers were staring at Su Le with cold gazes. They were from the 3rd Military District and had been silent these past few days. Only when the officers found out Su Le's true identity did the coldness in their eyes grow thicker and thicker. The members of Team 7 who were listening in stood far away at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the trees and lying on the stone steps, their figures lazy. They were also very curious about Su Le's strength. Seeing was believing. They wanted to see if their supervisor was as ferocious as Lao Bai had said. Only Zhou Yu laughed bitterly and turned his head away, unwilling to see Hua Xiaoxi's miserable appearance later. "You're the instructor. I won't hit your face." The wind rose on the field. Hua Xiaoxi's face was dark. The moment he attacked, it was the sharpest direct attack of the military special forces. At this time, Su Le was still wearing his sunglasses. His eyes narrowed under the lenses, and he allowed the fierce wind from the fist to hit him in the face. Only then did his left hand flip up casually, blocking the bend of the opponent's elbow. He took 3 steps forward. The edge of his palm, his fingertips, his wrist, and the hard tip of his elbow sprayed out like raindrops, hitting Hua Xiaoxi's body like a drum. His movements were too fast. It was like countless shadows flashing between the two of them. Hua Xiaoxi barely covered his chest and retreated. He felt a wave of pain and numbness on his body and arm. He couldn't help but turn pale. He didn't know what the instructor's body was made of to be able to reach such a fast speed. Just as everyone was shocked and Hua Xiaoxi was retreating with a grunt, Su Le suddenly pulled back his fist, raised his right leg, and struck out like a bolt of lightning, hitting the outer side of Hua Xiaoxi's knee. Hua Xiaoxi's strength was all concentrated on the defense of his upper body. His body suddenly lost its balance. Like a scene in a movie, he flipped in the air and then fell tragically onto the hard ground with a muffled thud. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.